Chapter 9:16 Irresistible approach. Upon seeing this coiling feathered serpent deep inside the black fog, and a face at the top of the towering figure, Azek was first taken aback. Following that, the corner of his forehead throbbed as though he had been struck in the temple, splitting his head in two. Amidst the excruciating pain, several incontiguous scenes flashed in his mind. It was a feathered serpent with a face identical to his, even to the smallest detail. Above a silent land, there were countless pale corpses, floating in midair. There were clouds stacked from bones that came from different species, black tentacles that drilled out from the ground, with eyes that resembled dead fish at the tip of each tentacle. A transparent spirit body was forcefully pulled out of his body. After these flashing scenes, a pair of white flaming eyes that were on the brink of extinguishing glanced over. A white feather stained with yellow oil fluttered down, splitting Azek's transparent spirit body into two. One of the parts suddenly flew up and plunged inside the cloud of bones. The remaining part fused with a golden accessory that had appeared out of thin air. Amidst the pale white flames, it materialized back into a body of flesh and blood. This scene was like a thunder god's hammer striking down at Azek's mind, again and again, making the pain hardly bearable. He raised his hand to his head as his knees gradually buckled as he knelt on the staircase. He had finally recalled everything that had happened, and he understood the reason why he was constantly dying and reviving, always losing his memories and having to recover them every single time. His soul wasn't complete. Similarly, Azek also understood why the feathered serpent suppressing the entire space in the depths of the black fog had an identical face as his. It was him. That was the other Azek Eggers. And all of this was a concealed attempt before death's fall. If stitching souls existed, there was naturally the splitting of souls. At that moment, the crazy and powerful death had seemingly foreseen his outcome. Unwilling to die so simply, Eat secretly split the soul of his son, Balam Empire's death console. He took half of it away and used another item as a replacement, stitching it together with Azek's soul. It was a mystery if it was a deliberate arrangement of death, or if it was an unintended consequence of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death project. The half-soul that had been taken away from artificial death had fused with the target of the artificial death project, the uniqueness of the death pathway. It made the latter gain certain innate abilities as it began influencing high-sequence beyonders of the corpse collector pathway who had failed their advancement. And for the other half, although there was a replacement that prevented it from being incomplete, the incomplete soul resulted in repeated deaths and resurrection just like Sequence 4's Undying. And due to the golden accessory inside his body, and the calling from the other half-soul, Azek, who started a brand new life every incarnation, would gradually recover his past memories with the passage of time. In the past, artificial death had attempted to identify the reason, but due to the natural recovery of his memories, he was often already close to death once more. He wasn't able to perform any in-depth investigations. Furthermore, the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death project had been raised in the past few centuries. It was only in recent times that they received some level of success. That was why he never found the answer. Ha! 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 At some point in time, Azek's hands had left his head. They were placed on the staircase as his throat produced a voice that didn't sound human. Drops of sweat dripped down his forehead and hit the stone steps in front of him. They spread out into a layer of pale yellow oil, growing out into dense white feathers. At that instant, he felt the other half of his soul calling out, as well as its desire. The two selves, which had been separated for more than 1,000 years, were eager to fuse as one, to be whole again. No, Azek muttered in pain, unwilling to raise his head or reach out his right hand. He had seen it clearly. Him as a feathered serpent didn't have any reason. It was filled with extreme coldness and madness. If he became one with it again, he would probably immediately be restored to his state as a death console from before. He might even become a fake death who only had godhood with zero humanity. He would forget everything, forgetting everyone who he had once cherished. No, Azek's throat squeezed out the same word again. Irresistibly, he raised his neck bit by bit as pitch-black and gloomy scales appeared. At his forehead, something that took a life of its own protruded out. His forehead cracked as a bloody opening appeared. A golden sliver of light emitted out of nothingness, taking form inside the flesh and blood. This ancient accessory made of gold was in the shape of a tall, slender bird. Pale white flames emanated around it in the form of feathers. Inside its bronze eyes, there were shimmering layers of light that separately formed a mysterious and illusory door. The moment it appeared, Azek let out a painful growl. He raised his head completely as two wisps of pale white flames burst in his eyes that had experienced much. Deep inside the black fog, the illusory and real feathered serpent had straightened its body. It reached its head out as the two identical faces of different sizes looked at each other in silence. As four pale white flames leaped, bit by bit, Azek, whose hands were on the ground, struggled to stand up with a warped expression. Slowly, he walked to the feathered serpent known as Artificial Death. As he approached, the entire mausoleum began shaking. The surroundings turned transparent, reflecting a world with countless skeletons and shadows. Bloody arms, bluish-black vines with baby faces, and slimy tentacles with dead fish eyes or two rows of sharp teeth tore through the boundary between reality and the illusory, reaching into the mausoleum. However, they clung straight to the ground without daring to move. East Balam, Colane City. Daily Simone, who was rushing to her next target's location, suddenly stopped in her steps and held her head. "What's wrong?" Red Glove's team captain, Soest, asked in puzzlement. Daly frowned slightly as she answered, seemingly in reverie, "I hear strange voices. I can sense the calling that stems from an unknown place. I even wish to kneel to the ground. Can the rest of you hear it?" Soest prudently asked the other teammates. Just as Leonard Mitchell shook his head, he heard the slightly aged voice in his mind. "Look towards the Berserk Sea." Leonard subconsciously turned his body and looked in the direction of the harbor towards the distant Berserk Sea. He saw a swath of pure, deep black darkness. There weren't any gales, massive waves, dark clouds, lightning, torrential rain, or sunlight. Although Klein had his eyes closed, his outstanding spiritual perception allowed him to sense his surroundings. When he heard the painful murmurs and shouts that sounded like Mr. Azek, he could sense seemingly corporeal silence and the aura of death. What's happening? Although the artificial death deep in the mausoleum didn't attack Mr. Azek, it has inflicted him with adverse effects? Klein's mind raced as he felt anxious and worried. His spiritual intuition told him that what was about to happen was not something he wished to see. However, he couldn't figure out what he could do. He didn't even dare open his eyes to look at Mr. Azek's present state or whatever he had encountered. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with mere courage. It was a difference in the natural order of life, an unbridgeable gap. Suddenly, Klein had a strong feeling of helplessness. However, he didn't give up as he tried hard to think of whatever items he had on him that could be of use. Creeping hunger? No, it's at a completely different level. It won't be of any use. Death knell? Even worse. Grozel's travels? I didn't bring it. Neither did I bring the Black Emperor card and Tyrant card. Fate Siphon Charm. Yes, the Fate Siphon Charm. Klein was delighted as he formulated a plan. It was to use the Fate Siphon Charm to temporarily swap his fate with Mr. Azek. He would suffer the influence created by artificial death in his place. At the very least, I still have a chance of reviving. As for Mr. Azek, the deaths he previously suffered wouldn't from the damage inflicted. Who knows if he can awaken again in such a situation? Klein didn't consider if the Fate Siphon Charm was effective on Azek and artificial death. He only wished to give it a try. He raised his right hand and reached into his pocket. Then, there was a delay in his actions. His arm rose a little before landing back in its original location. He froze for a moment as though he had been petrified into being a stone sculpture. Klein's lips quivered a few times as his expression distorted indiscernibly. Following that, he swung his right arm and reached his palm into his pocket and pulled it out. Gripped tightly in his palm was a black crystal card-like charm. At the same time, Azik was approaching the towering illusory feathered serpent. His footsteps sped up as though he was returning to his throne. However, his eyes, which had pale white flames, were filled with pain. His expression was extremely warped. "No," Azik muttered once again. Wherever his skin was exposed, white feathers stained with yellow oil grew out from the gaps of pitch-black scales. The intense shouting and desire made him lose control of himself. He was about to soar into the sky and leap towards the gigantic feathered serpent that shared his face. Pale white flames spread out from the bird-shaped accessory at his forehead, flowing towards the rest of his body. Klein's spiritual intuition was sending warnings as he hurriedly said a single word in ancient Hermes, fate. Just as he was about to use the charm, his surroundings suddenly quietened. There was no longer any sound. A slender, fair female palm appeared out of nowhere and pressed down on the golden bird-shaped accessory on Azik's forehead. A figure then materialized between Azik and the towering illusory feathered serpent, stopping the two's approach. With the help of this external force, Azik finally held back that desire and the irresistible calling to fuse together. The pale white flames in his eyes reflected the floating figure in midair. It was a beautiful lady wearing an ancient robe. She wore a black hood. Her face was deadpan, and her black eyes were deep and dark, devoid of spirituality. Chapter 9:17 Three Choices. The strange turn of events inside the mausoleum left Klein, who had his eyes closed and his spirituality converged, completely unaware of what was happening. He had no idea if it was something good or bad. Therefore, even though he had already chanted the activation incantation, he still didn't dare rashly use the Fate Siphon charm. He was afraid it would make things worse or that it would have the opposite effect. Seconds passed as Klein felt the passage of time was especially slow. He felt as though an entire century had passed. Finally, he heard Mr. Azik speak with a somewhat hoarse and uncertain tone, "It's you." Following that, an unperturbed voice that was clearly female sounded, "You have three choices. First, continue proceeding forward to seek completeness. Allow Salinger to revive within your body. The second is to have me help you extract that half-soul, allowing you to take it with you. You will think of a way to stitch it back together, but this will make you transform back to your original form. You will stop repeatedly dying and reviving, but it will not be the present you. Your past incarnations will truly reseed into being dreams. Third, it's to give up everything and directly leave. You will forever be stuck at your current level. You will have no way of advancing further. You will still die again and again, waking up with no memories, and repeatedly search for your past experiences." Klein was taken aback by what he heard. He never expected that there was another person in the depths of the mausoleum. Furthermore, she appeared to have absolute authority. She provided the former death consul, Azik Eggers, different choices that he could choose from. This is that the artificial death that's hiding deep in the black fog? No, he originally didn't seem to have any intelligence. It's been so long, and it's not like he has tried communicating. Extract the half-soul and think of a way to stitch it together. What does that mean? Azik's soul was not whole to begin with. Extract it from where? The lady speaking is actually able to do something Mr. Azik is incapable of? Also, who is Salinger? Why would he be revived in Mr. Azik's body? He is death that caused the pale disaster, Mr. Azik's father or grandfather? He foresaw his death, hence, he left a seed in Mr. Azik's body for him to revive? The first choice is definitely something to eliminate without any thought. The second and third choice each have their own problems. The former makes him not his current self. He will become an unfamiliar him. The latter is to suffer an undying curse for all eternity, never to receive salvation. If he's confident with himself, truly treating all the past incarnations as an anchor, then the second choice can be considered. It allows for reconciliation and a compromise. But this involves the splitting of a half-soul into half. It's impossible to guess what developments will happen to the other half-soul which didn't experience those incarnations in the future. The anchor might not be able to resolve the problem. Ideas flashed through Klein's mind. He was puzzled, curious, stumped, and confused. He was so near, yet so far from a solution. It was Isaac's life. It was a future he needed to face. No one else could make the decision for him. And whatever Klein needed to say had been said. He stood there helpless and worried, waiting for Mr. Isaac to speak again. Isaac looked at the beautiful hooded lady in front of him without saying a word. The pale white eyes in his eyes flickered. The illusory but real towering feathered serpent seemed to sense a negative development. It suddenly lashed out its tail, wildly sweeping it around as it lunged its head downward and opened its gaping mouth, revealing dark red flesh and fangs that were tainted with yellow oil stains. It stuck out its black serpent tongue and spat dark green slime in a bid to devour Isaac Eggers. However, all of its attempts failed to be effective. It seemed to live in another world. Amidst the unsettling silence, Isaac raised his right hand and rubbed his temples. Calmly, he said with a laugh, "Perhaps I'm accustomed to my present life. I choose the third choice." Just as he said that, the hooded lady clenched her fist, gripping the golden bird-shaped accessory tightly. Then, she retracted her arm, pulling out the ancient item from the gap in Isaac's forehead. Isaac's expression distorted once again as though he was experiencing unimaginable pain. Every drop of his blood, and in every piece of flesh, there were some parts of his soul seeping out, mixing together into a transparent soul. This soul appeared complete, but it was filled with discordant and disharmonious feelings. It was because it was half gold in color, the same all the way from the brows, eyes, to the torso, and its four limbs. It had an ancient simplistic beauty. As the golden bird-shaped accessory was extracted, Isaac's translucent soul began to disintegrate inch by inch, as though it was being skinned alive. His throat let out an unhuman gasping sound once again, causing Klein's head to spin and ache. It felt as though a needle had stabbed into his brain and was stirred wildly. In seconds, Isaac's spirit body completely split into two. Half of it transformed into a golden stream that infused into the bird-shaped accessory, while the other half returned to his body, fusing with his flesh and blood. The two pale white flames in Isaac's eyes were extinguished as the white feathers and pitch-black scales on his body receded. His warped expression also eased as he no longer looked as savage. His expression turned slightly pale and translucent as his forehead throbbed. Clearly, he was suffering a pain that stemmed from deep within his soul body. "Thank you for your help." He bowed towards the beautiful hooded lady. He turned around and floated up the staircase, coming to Klein's side. "You can open your eyes now," Isaac said with an exhausted smile. Klein hurriedly opened his eyes and sized up Isaac. Realizing that there weren't any signs of madness or loss of control, he was completely relieved. He curiously cast his gaze deep into the mausoleum. The black fog was still emanating, completely blanketing everything underneath. Who was that? He couldn't help but ask. Isaac laughed and reached out to grip his shoulder. "Even if I were to tell you, you wouldn't be able to hear it unless Sheik is willing to let you know." As he spoke, Klein subconsciously grabbed his two marionettes' shoulders. The colors around them saturated and clearly stacked upon one another. The two men and two marionettes quickly passed through the spirit world corresponding to the Berserk Sea, returning to Klein's inn in Colaine City. Isaac released his grip and pinched his forehead. With a gentle smile, he said, "I'll need to sleep for an unknown length of time in order to recover." If you have any questions, you can seek out the Spirit World's 7 lights. You should already be aware of the corresponding ritual. Mr. Isaac, are you all right? Klein asked in concern. At the same time, he rebuked himself. How can he be fine having lost half his soul forever? Isaac laughed and said, "It's not a big deal. I'll just be maintaining my previous state, allowing me to foresee my death and arrange everything, severing ties with my original life. I'll then forget everything and reawaken in search of my past. Like before, at least you're there, someone who knows a lot about my past. If I were to forget once again, should be able to recall a lot when I receive your letter." He paused and nodded indiscernibly as he chuckled. Sleep isn't a bad thing either. At least I'll have dreams. In my dreams, I never left, accompanying her while taking in the sun while guiding that stubborn son of mine to use the broadsword. I'll also make a swing for that little kid that loves to wheedle. Having said that, Isaac threw out the copper whistle and said with a gentle smile, "Remember to write to me. But before I awaken, I will not reply to you." Just as Klein reached out to receive the ancient and intricate copper whistle, Isaac vanished from the room, his whereabouts an unknown. After blankly watching this scene for a while, Klein suddenly let out a sigh. To go anywhere else from Colane City by land, one needed to follow the spiraling path that led upwards. After passing through the different streets, one would arrive at the peak of the city. Then, one had to descend the mountain and enter a plain. At this moment, the Red Gloves team that Soest led was standing on a square at the peak, looking down at the abnormal Berserk Sea. Daily Simone, who had been pressing her forehead all this time, suddenly lowered her hand as she said, feeling somewhat puzzled, "Everything has been returned to normal. There's no more problems." "Normal?" Leonard returned with a question in puzzlement. From his point of view, it was very difficult for Daly to return to normal before the end of the Berserk Sea's abnormality. Perhaps it's intermittent? Soest hesitatingly raised a theory. Daly was just about to answer when everyone's spiritual perception was triggered. Once again, they looked towards the Berserk Sea. In the swath of pure blackness, one bright star after another lit up. Backlund. Beneath St. Samuel Cathedral. Archbishop Anthony Stevenson received an emergency telegram from the sea. The telegram's content was rather simple, but it was sufficiently shocking. Gehrman Sparrow has appeared, boarding the Black Tulip with another person. He has made Ludwell into a marionette and left with the person Ludwell addressed as Death Consul. Gehrman Sparrow. Death Consul. Saint Anthony silently repeated these two names. He leaned back slightly and closed his eyes. Once again, the corresponding complete information of the sealed artifact, 0 to 17 appeared in his mind. Number, 17. Name, Angel of Concealment, Danger Grade, 0, extremely dangerous. It's of the highest importance and of the highest confidentiality. It is not to be inquired, disseminated, described, or spied. Security clearance, Pope, team of researchers, and Archbishop of the Backlund Diocese, sealed method. The seal is completed through the combination of 1 to 29 and 1 to 80. Description: this isn't an item. Warning: she cannot be used. Appendix 1: this sealed artifact first appeared in the Pale Era of the Fourth Epoch. Exact year, missing. Exact date, missing. Exact location, missing. Appendix 2, based on the information, she has been awakened 5 times. Appendix 3, a limited premise is the reason behind its inability to be used. It has been confirmed that she can be used as the goddess's descent vessel. Chapter 9: 18 Guesses and Ideas. Colane City. Inside the inn. Klein sat on a reclining chair, reaching out to receive the black tea with lemon from Winner Enzo. Beside him, Admiral Hell Ludwell stood straight, wearing a mask with a rapier by his waist. He appeared like the most loyal guard. Only at this point in time did Klein, who had completely calmed down, have the mental capacity to analyze what had happened in Death's mausoleum. Amongst all of that, what he paid most attention to was the existence that had helped Mr. Azik get out of his predicament at the critical moment and provide him with 3 choices. First, a female voice. Second, this matter is definitely advantageous to her. Otherwise, no one would cross such a great distance to provide assistance. Of course, if she happened to pass by and had helped Mr. Azik out of goodwill, that's also completely understandable and acceptable. But the problem is that the mausoleum is a product formed from Death's godly powers when he perished, a product of the characteristic, corpses, and the natural environment. Without the corresponding key, even deities can't find it. With a door that cannot be opened, how is it possible for anyone to be passing by? Also, Mr. Azik's actions had been very sudden. He didn't first seek out the members of the numinous episcopate that are carrying out the artificial death project for information. He directly followed the calling and arrived at the Berserk Sea and entered Death's treasure trove. If it's not someone who can locate me or him, or them being someone who has a strong prescient ability, there's almost no existence that can arrive in such a timely manner. Finally, the Salinger that can revive via Mr. Azik's body is almost certainly the "I'm mad, but I'm stronger" Death from the 4th epoch. That female voice directly addressed him by his name without showing any signs of respect. This. As Klein seriously analyzed the information, he suddenly had a theory, but he couldn't help but avoid the possibility. Based on what he knew, the Evernight, Death, and Giant Beyonder pathways were a group of its own. They could be interchanged at high sequences. And other than using the honorific name of Lady of Crimson or some special grade O sealed artifact to occupy a portion of the moon's authority, the goddess also had the title Mistress of Repose and Silence. That totally pointed to the underworld and Death's domain. And back at the foggy town, and with his use of the holy sword to make a vow with the goddess bearing witness, as well as the goddess clearly possessing the authority of misfortune, it made Klein believe that he had entered her special watch list, just like how he singled out certain believers using the sea god scepter. Making a bold assumption and seeking careful verification, then almost all the questions can be answered if she really was the goddess. As one of the 7 orthodox deities, as one of the winners of the Pale Era, she has the level and right to address Death by his name. And having been labeled by her, once anything abnormal happens, such as me entering a strange place like Death's treasure trove, she would definitely sense it and take the necessary action in response. Furthermore, as it definitely requires some time, she didn't manage to stop it at the beginning. To her, that artificial death, or the death pathway's uniqueness that had initially come to life, clearly enhances her authority in the aspects of repose and silence. It might even allow her to directly intrude into Death's domain, just like what the Mother Tree of Desire did to the chained god. When Death perished, the 3 sequence 1 characteristics should have automatically separated. It's unknown who received them. If the goddess is searching for them, perhaps ruler of the ancient underworld, Lady of all the undead will be added to her title. Although Mr. Azik has been pursued by the Church's high-sequence Beyonders, he has ultimately never suffered any real threats. From the looks of it, the goddess has been waiting all this time for today's development. Upon coming to this realization, Klein suddenly felt a little frightened. He was rather pious. At the very least, he superficially raised his right hand in a pious manner. Tapping 4 spots in a clockwise manner on his chest, he formed the sign of the crimson moon and muttered, "Praise the Lady." This made him recall the answer he received when he asked Snake of Fate Will Septon about obtaining the high-sequence Beyonder potion formulas of the Seer pathway. Can only be obtained from the crazy Zeradol or the Hornacis mountain range. If you are the blessed of the Evernight, treat it as though I didn't say it. After the incident at the foggy town, Klein had already discovered that heading to the Hornacis mountain range and finding Zeradol was the same choice. Even stealing the Antigonus family's notebook from St. Samuel Cathedral's basement was the same. And up to this date, he realized that the second line was not without meaning. He stroked his chin and muttered, perhaps, maybe, possibly. I'm really considered a blessed of the Evernight. Towards this, Klein wasn't too unreceptive to it. On the one hand, he had spent the first few months after coming to this world with the Church of Evernight's Tingen Nighthawks team. He had a group of great teammates and colleagues. He had a rather heartwarming life and acceptable ideals. To this day, he still recalled the past, therefore, although he wasn't a worshipper of the Evernight goddess, he was very accepting of this deity. On the other hand, at least on what he had seen to date, the Evernight goddess had yet to show any ill intent. Instead, she had given him some blessings. Klein believed that since he had been specially marked, it was unlikely that he could be free from it any time soon. All he could do was learn to accept it and make good use of it. Of course, I can't let down my guard. In addition, I already have too many enemies in the form of the Mother Tree of Desire, True Creator, Primordial Demoness, Primordial Moon, Blasphemer Amon, Angel of Fate Ouroboros, and others. Some of them might even be able to get a hold of my location at any time. Without finding someone powerful to cozy up to, my future will really be difficult. With so many things on his plate, Klein quickly adjusted his state of mind. To him, as long as the goddess had labeled him from the moment he made the vow using the holy sword, and not earlier, as well as not constantly monitoring him, he found it acceptable. At least from the special labels afforded to me by the Sea God Scepter, constant monitoring isn't possible. Mr. Azek will be sleeping for a very long period of time. The goddess can't just do a divine descent as she pleases. There must be some corresponding obstacles and difficulties. Otherwise, the 7 orthodox deities would have made divine descents all across the world to resolve all kinds of problems. That's why I should keep a low profile and behave myself in the southern continent. I shouldn't try to pin my hopes on an external factor. Klein reminded himself before scrutinizing his new marionette, Admiral Hell Ludwell. To be frank, he was rather curious about the face hidden beneath the silver mask. But upon recalling how there was an anomaly when Ludwell took off his mask in their previous battle, he held back his thoughts. He planned to make the attempt again after he left the city and did it in the woods or somewhere uninhabited. After some work, Klein gained a rough understanding of his new marionette sequence and powers. Ludwell was Sequence 5 Gatekeeper of the Death Pathway, and he wasn't a normal human. The corresponding Sequence 9 was Corpse Collector. Back in Tingen, Klein had already learned of its specifics. He knew that they possessed certain traits of a corpse. Their entire being appeared rather cold and grim, and their body temperatures were relatively low. This allowed them to avoid being attacked by dead unintelligent spirits. At the same time, they also had their physical bodies enhanced. They gained resistance to the cold, decay, and corrosiveness of cadaveric auras. They were naturally equipped with spirit vision, and they understood the characteristics and weaknesses of undead creatures. Sequence 8 was Gravedigger. Corpse collectors who advanced to this sequence become stronger. Their spirit vision was further enhanced as their agility increased. They were able to communicate with nearby spirits, allowing them to provide the Beyonder with help. Other than that, Gravediggers could quickly find the weaknesses of unfamiliar undead creatures and spirit world creatures via observation. This was known as the Eye of Death. Sequence 7 Spirit Medium was a qualitative change. Beyonders of this sequence gained knowledge of various kinds of mysticism rituals related to spirits. They could directly communicate with the natural spirits and loitering dead souls in the real world. Hence, they had informants everywhere. At the same time, they could use different spirits to actualize different kinds of magic, creating various kinds of supernatural phenomena in a rather multifaceted way. Sequence 6 Spirit Guide and Sequence 5 Gatekeeper didn't experience a qualitative change from Spirit Medium other than an increase in the range for communication. Spirit guides began involving themselves with the spirit world as they began hiring messengers and receiving the help of certain spirit world creatures. Gatekeeper could sense the entrance to the underworld, allowing them to control the dead spirits inside, doing so as though they watched over the gates that separated the dead from the living from spirit medium onwards. With the advancement of each sequence, the quantity and quality of natural spirits, undead creatures, spirit world creatures that the Beyonders could control and order increased exponentially. Spirit Guide gained the use of the additional language of the dead that circumvented the protection provided by one's physical body. Focused on the ability to communicate with a spirit body, the ability was enhanced to giving an order, to the point of slavery. Gatekeepers could even open the mysterious gate that separated life and death to a certain extent, opening the gates to the underworld. If it wasn't for the natural restraints that Azek's copper whistle had on the corpse collector pathway's control over spirits, I probably wouldn't have even had what it takes to fight Admiral Hell back then. And even now, if not for traveling to ensure my safety, I might not be able to finish Ludwell off, even if I used demigod-level powers. In the future, I have to take note when taking revenge on Insangwil. He was once a gatekeeper after all. Klein nodded slightly, raised the cup, and drank a mouthful of black tea. As for the weapon Ludwell had, it was named Harris Rapier. It originated from a prince from the southern continent in ancient times. It didn't directly correspond to any sequence or pathway. It was more of a product that was similar to King of the North Ulyssen, who gathered similar characteristics without any proper rules. It only had one Beyonder power, bringing absolute destruction to the items it stabbed. As a pirate admiral with the highest bounty, Ludwell didn't only have this mystical item. Unfortunately, his most precious death ring had been taken by Azek. As for the silver mask on him, Klein temporarily had no way of taking it off for research. Also, he really doesn't like money. He has zero need for money. Klein lowered his cup and retracted his gaze. Considering how it was still early, he planned on leaving Colane City and heading elsewhere to wait for Danitz to finish his investigations. Chapter 919 Perfect Inference Backlund, Sherwood Borough. Furs, who was having an afternoon nap, jolted awake from her dreams. She saw an endless grayish-white fog and Mr. Moon, who had his head bowed in prayer, clearly hearing his voice. In the southeast outskirts of Backlund, in the middle of Delaire Forest, there is an abandoned ancient castle. In it are at least 2 ancient wraiths, and other dead spirits. The possibility of other Beyonders living there cannot be eliminated. The coordinates are, I finally have information on the main ingredient of scribe. Information worth 300 pounds. Furs was instantly delighted as she immediately thanked Mr. Fool and sought him to pass her message to the Moon that she would make payment shortly. After completing this, she got out of bed and went to the first floor. She planned on pouring herself some wine to drink and consider when she would explore the abandoned castle, as well as the necessary preparations. For the meantime, Laymanow's travels cannot be rented out. Zion needs to come along. That abandoned castle has several dead spirits and is rather dangerous. I have to consider the combination of spells. If there's anything lacking or not specialized, I'll hire Mr. World, Mr. Hanged Man, and the Sun to record the corresponding Beyonder powers. Although Furs lacked actual combat experience, she had been mixing with Beyonder circles for years. Later, she had joined the Tarot Club, and having heard and seen much, she naturally knew the need for preparations before any adventures. As for directly hiring Mr. World to do it, she had long struck it off her list of options. She believed that giving all the spoils and her savings to him wasn't enough to hire him. Of course, if her attempts at exploration proved that the abandoned castle was extremely dangerous, something that a Beyonder at her sequence couldn't enter, she would have no choice but to shoulder an enormous debt. After all, there was only hope and a future from being alive. In theory, I shouldn't reach that stage. There are still 2 demigod-level Beyonder powers left on Laymanow's travels from Mr. World. At most, I'll use it first and think of means to make up for it in the future. The only problem is that the 2 demigod-level Beyonder powers might not be suitable against wraiths and dead spirits. Furs sipped some black rand as her various thoughts took form. At this point, she heard a key latching into the keyhole as she instinctively looked towards the door. The door suddenly opened as Xiao walked in, carrying 2 paper bags that emitted a rich fragrance. "Desi pies?" Furs asked immediately before frowning in puzzlement. "Haven't you had lots of commissions recently? Why are you back so early?" Xiao threw a bag of desi pies over and said without hiding her smile, "I happened to walk past it. I also hadn't had lunch, so I planned on taking a break." Without waiting for Furs to ask further, she said, "I've accumulated enough points. I can soon exchange them for the interrogator potion formula." Although her monitoring of Royal Guard Captain, Viscount Stratford, hadn't had any significant progress, it was the kind that accumulated points on a daily basis. All she needed to do was submit a passable report every week to receive the corresponding bounty. Therefore, together with the other commissions and their varying levels of success, Xiao had already earned enough to obtain the interrogator potion formula. Finally, Furs sincerely felt happy for her friend. Then, she shook the wine cup in her hand. "Shall we celebrate with a drink?" At the same time, she also thought of something pertaining to herself. "This is great. After becoming a Sequence 7, Xiao should have experienced a qualitative change. It will make exploring that ancient castle a sure thing." Xiao looked at the transparent liquid in the cup before shaking her head incessantly. "Drinking is bad." With that said, she frowned. "Besides, I abhor the smell." Before Furs could speak, she suddenly recalled something. She stood up and walked to the door. "I saw the mailbox filled with things. Haven't you opened it today?" "I didn't have the time." Furs wore a look as though she was busy rushing out her drafts. Xiao was a person of action. Ignoring her explanation, she had already headed out to clear the mailbox. About 10 seconds later, she walked back in with a stack of newspapers and a few envelopes. As she looked at the addressee, she said, "It's all yours." 2 letters from the publisher. One's an invitation letter from a surgery forum. One letter is from Pritz Harbor. Pritz Harbor. Furz's mind stirred as she put down her cup, and caught the letter Xiao threw at her. She seemed to openly tear open all the letters in front of her friend, discovering that one of the letters was indeed from her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham. Calderon City is in a rather special spot deep in the spirit world. I'm not sure of its origins other than it's very dangerous. A demigod had once stepped in without ever coming out. When selling the actual spirit world coordinates to that gathering's member, there's a need for you to warn him, Mr. World's target is such a dangerous spirit world city? Furs stared at the letter in her hand as her eyes widened. The Red Gloves team which had arrived at the next East Balam city had rendezvoused with the local Nighthawks, taking up an office of theirs. "Everyone shall have half the day off. We will start tomorrow morning." Soas took out his pocket watch and opened it. They were about to strike a secret gathering location of the numinous episcopate to find more information of the artificial death project and dig out another batch of enemies that hid in Backland. As for the information obtained from Ulika, they had already sent it back to Backland via telegram. They didn't need to worry about the subsequent work. After all, they weren't the only Red Gloves team. Backland's local Nighthawks were aplenty and powerful. Leonard and Daly were just about to seek out their lodgings to rest, and a Nighthawk with some East Balam blood walked in with a piece of paper. A new telegram from Backland. Soast reached out to take it, and after opening it for a few seconds, he said with a grave expression, "Gehrman Sparrow has appeared again. Using divination methods, it has been confirmed that it's him." Gehrman Sparrow. Leonard wasn't surprised by this outcome. He already knew from Dwayne Dantes that his former colleague, Klein Moretti, was still alive. He curiously asked, "What did Gehrman Sparrow do again?" Soast surveyed the area and sternly said, "He boarded the Black Tulip and turned Admiral Hell Ludwell into his marionette." Admiral Hell? Ludwell? Marionette? The Red Gloves could hardly hide their astonishment as they exclaimed one after another. Even Leonard Mitchell was extremely surprised. One had to know that Admiral Hell Ludwell, who wore the ring left by death, had the highest bounty among the 7 pirate admirals. He was publicly recognized to be the strongest beneath the 4 kings. He was definitely not someone an ordinary Sequence 5 could compare to. As for Gehrman Sparrow, he had actually boarded his ship, turning Admiral Hell into his marionette despite being surrounded by the latter's, undead army and subordinates. Although they didn't know much about a faceless and a marionettist, just the term marionette was enough to let them know that Admiral Hell Ludwell's outcome was worse than death. He's already this strong? He infiltrated St. Samuel Cathedral's Chinese Gate to meet the requirements for a demigod ritual? Leonard gradually fell silent as he didn't ask more. At this moment, Soest offered more information. According to the crew that escaped from the Black Tulip, there wasn't a fight back then. Gehrman Sparrow and another man boarded the ship. The moment Admiral Hell Ludwell saw them, he gave up any resistance and prostrated himself onto the deck, calling the man Death Consul. Later, he allowed Gehrman Sparrow to turn him into his marionette. Death Consul, Leonard subconsciously turned to look at Daly Simone. He believed that this Sequence 5 Beyonder of the Corpse Collector pathway likely knew what Death Consul meant. Daly scoffed and shook her head. I only know that the former Balam Empire, a blood descendant of death that ruled the real world, was known as Death Consul. However, the Numinous Episcopate's royal faction's leader has never called himself Death Consul, another Red Glove, Cindy, mentioned in puzzlement. This was rather open knowledge amongst the Nighthawks. Those that reached Sequence 7 and above, or those who joined the Red Gloves, had the right to be privy to this information. As for the Artificial Death faction, it was even more unlikely for any of them to call themselves Death Consul. Who knows? Perhaps the Numinous Episcopate has fractured again. Now, there's an additional Death Consul faction. Daly first made a casual comment before she thought and said, Gehrman Sparrow has a mysterious origin. His motives for infiltrating Chinese Gate is unknown. Perhaps, it's really related to the Numinous Episcopate. The Numinous Episcopate had always been a main target that the Church of Evernight had been trying to take down. The conflict between the two ran deep. Her statement reminded Leonard Mitchell of something because he knew that Gehrman Sparrow was Klein Moretti. Furthermore, he had joined a secret organization that worshipped the Fool and represented itself with tarot cards and had a working relationship with the Numinous Episcopate. In the few factions of the Numinous Episcopate, there's no Death Consul. Admiral Hell Ludwell can almost be confirmed to be an arm of the Numinous Episcopate. Dealing with him is equivalent to dealing with the Numinous Episcopate. Dwayne Dantes once said that the members of that secret organization come from different places with different goals. Klein's goal is revenge. Could the goal of one of the members be to strike the Numinous Episcopate, to gradually absorb them to revive or recreate death in their own image? Since there's an undying monster like Dwayne Dantes who lived since the 4th epoch, it's normal for that secret organization to have an additional ancient Death Consul. Perhaps, his corresponding tarot card is death. As his mind raced, Leonard began believing that he had obtained the truth. Then, he made a connection with certain details. Dwayne Dantes is an undying creature who had lived since the 4th epoch. He knows the southern continent very well. He recently left Backlund and has gone missing. Leonard was alarmed. Taking the opportunity while his teammates were in discussion, he lifted his teacup and covered his mouth, softly muttering to himself, "Old man, could Dwayne Dantes be the Death Consul?" Palaz Zorost's slightly aged voice said with a smiling tone, "No, Balam Empire's Death Consul is both a rank and a title. It's also the name of the Death Pathway's Sequence 2. Sequence 2. That secret organization even has a Sequence 2 angel." Leonard's pupils constricted as he muttered once again, "How are you so certain that Dwayne Dantes isn't the Death Consul? Because he's not an angel?" Palaz immediately chuckled. "No. The reason is very simple. You've seen the real Death Consul's portrait before. Back when you Nighthawks were investigating Welch's suicide. You might have even met him personally. He's a teacher at Koei University's Department of History, Isaac Eggers. Isaac Eggers. Leonard was taken aback before he came to a realization. He finally understood how Klein Moretti was able to resurrect from the dead, why he was fine suffering curses, or why he could join the secret organization symbolized by tarot cards, doing all of that while usually not showing anything special about himself. The reason was that behind Klein was a member of the secret organization with the corresponding tarot card, Death. Chapter 920 Calderon's Origins Biome, The Slums. Hooded with a mask underneath it, the hanged man Alger once again met with Admiral of Stars Catlia. At a table, the two of them sat across each other, facing each other without saying a word. Finally, Catlia said, "Have you heard the news?" Alger didn't directly answer as he returned with a question, "The one about Gehrman Sparrow?" Catlia fell silent for a few seconds and nodded. "He has turned Admiral Hell into his marionette. Be it Admiral of Blood from before or the present Admiral Hell, they were both pirates who had a higher bounty than her. No matter how confident she was of herself, she didn't believe that the two Sequence 5 elites were weaker than her. You learned of it earlier than I expected." Alger confirmed the authenticity of the news in a tactful manner. Being a member of the Church of Storms which controlled a large region of the sea, he could directly obtain the latest news from the official channels. Catlia curled her lips and said, "If the future were at sea, I might have to take days or even weeks to receive it. But I've been in Biome recently." She didn't divulge her intel source. After a pause, Admiral of Stars asked frankly, "What else do you know about this matter?" Alger shook his head. "I was trying to figure out the exact situation when I saw your signal, so I rushed here to meet you." Catlia nodded slightly. Gehrman Sparrow and Admiral Hell didn't engage in a battle. Ludwell didn't resist, because Gehrman Sparrow had boarded the Black Tulip with a man who was addressed as Death Consul. Death Consul. Alger's pupils dilated as he felt an indescribable pressure. Such a term wasn't something any random demigod could undertake. Furthermore, that wasn't something the man flaunted himself, but an honorific term that Admiral Hell Ludwell had used. Furthermore, he gave up resistance and was willing to lose his life. With the hanged man not saying a word, Catlia added, "In the death pathway, Death Consul is the name of the sequence too." Of course, every emperor of the Balam Empire was also given this title. Indeed, an angel from the death domain. Alger automatically ignored the latter possibility. After all, based on the acting method, the position of emperor was definitely held by a sequence 2 angel before the Balam Empire fell. And for someone who could make Admiral Hell become Gehrman Sparrow's marionette without putting up any resistance, they were definitely not something a mere title could accomplish. At this moment, Alger suddenly thought of something that left a deep impression on him. After Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos successfully fled, he was found standing by the side of an artificial lake. His face had rapidly rotted with pieces of flesh falling off. Even his eyeballs had rolled out of their sockets. It was undoubtedly the damage dealt by a potent force from the death domain. And Alger later confirmed that it was done by Mr. Fool's Blessed. To rapidly cause the death of a pirate admiral without him putting up any resistance, especially one who carried such a powerful sealed artifact, the assailant's level was obvious. The Church of Storms Spellsinger of God Archbishop Snake had determined at the scene that it was done by a high-sequence beyonder from the death pathway and that it was not the person he knew. Alger had no doubts about that. He believed that it was done by a sequence 4 or sequence 3 demigod, in other words, a saint. He also felt horrified that Mr. Fool's Blessed was a high-sequence beyonder. Now, he secretly gulped his saliva with great difficulty, believing that he had underestimated Mr. Fool back then as well as that Blessed. That person wasn't a saint but a grounded angel, one that shared the same level as the three crowns of the various Orthodox churches. When it came to religion, the three crowns represented the various churches' pope, pontiff, or chief shepherd. A death consul as a blessed. Although Mr. Fool is still recovering, the amount of strength at his disposal is quite sizable. Alger's thoughts churned as his eyes shimmered. He was momentarily at a loss for words. Cadlia sensed his gloom as she asked, "You seem to have recalled something." Alger deliberated for 2 seconds before vaguely replying, "Based on what I know, Mr. Fool has a death angel amongst his blessed." "That matches," Cadlia said as though she was muttering to herself. "Then why did the world promise me mythical creature blood that's not from that death angel? Is it due to having closer ties with the other one, making it easier to obtain?" Perhaps. Although Alger felt that Admiral of Stars's inference wasn't wrong, he habitually gave a non-committal answer. Cadlia didn't continue on the topic as she said, "We will start the operation tonight from 7:30 to 8. If you can participate in it, head over there with me." She has finally figured out the situation with the artisan? Alger secretly heaved a sigh of relief and asked in puzzlement, "Why that time?" This wasn't the most suitable period for any covert operation. Once any mistake was made, the official beyonders would quickly detect it and rush over. Cadlia nudged the heavy glasses on her nose and said with a complicated smile, "It's because it's dinner time for them. And they will be having mushrooms for dinner." What's the connection? The experienced Alger realized that he couldn't read the subcontext of Admiral of Stars's words. East Balam, in the lush and humid forest. Klein deliberately avoided the main path and came to an uninhabited area. He planned on getting Ludwell to take off his silver mask. This wasn't only to satisfy his curiosity but for a genuine reason. The silver mask was too striking. If he didn't deal with it, there was no amount of disguising that could direct the attention of others away from it. The biggest problem for a marionettist is the marionette's identity. The more powerful the marionette, the more famous they were while alive. Bringing one along with me has the risk of being exposed. If it wasn't because I didn't have the time to finish off the pirates on the Black Tulip, I would have had the means to keep it under wraps. For example, I could continue letting Ludwell be the captain while I pretend to be his subordinate. To a faceless, that's very simple. Klein sighed as he passed through the forest. There were many mosquitoes around him, but none of them came for him. All of them were circling Admiral Hell Ludwell, trying to suck his blood in vain. Klein had given his new marionette the green essence ring which attracted mosquitoes. This was because its effects were completely overshadowed by Flower of Blood. Wearing the 2 rings was rather meaningless for Winner Enzo. In addition, Klein had confirmed that Ludwell's situation was special. He wasn't too afraid of being bitten by mosquitoes. After walking a distance, Klein casually tossed a coin and stopped. After a few minutes of contemplation, he decided to finish something else before removing the new marionette's mask. This was because, through this process, he could confirm the severity of the latent danger beneath the mask. Taking out the corresponding items, Klein quickly set up a ritual and moved the radio transceiver from above the gray fog to the real world. He wanted to contact Rhodes. Before he left Colane City, he had paid Miss Magician £350 for the spirit world coordinates to Calderon City. He had also been warned about the extreme dangers associated with it. Therefore, he planned on obtaining more information from 2 channels in order to prepare for his hunting mission. The 2 channels involved asking the magic mirror and red light. With Mr. Azik being in prolonged slumber, Klein decided not to hesitate further. He planned on expanding his social circle, and not just stubbornly and inflexibly stick to the Evernight goddess. He needed to find powers to balance things out. And the relatively friendly 7 lights of the spirit world were the best choice. With the appearance of the radio transceiver, the surrounding woods suddenly turned gloomy. It was as though the spirit world had overlapped with the real world. In about 10 seconds, tapping sounds sounded. Illusory white paper began being spat out. Exalted Great Master, your puny, loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, is here to answer your summoning. There's temporarily no danger here. What say you? Seeing this coquettish manner of speech, Klein sighed silently and finally confirmed that he had connected to the magic mirror, Rhodes. He had previously been afraid that the white piece of paper would have the words, "I want to have a child with you." Of course, he had divined the level of danger of contacting Rhodes above the grey fog, and he obtained an answer that it was fine. However, with the mother tree of desire having a precedent of interfering with divination, as well as his misinterpretation of infiltrating St. Samuel Cathedral's Cheney's Gate, he wasn't too certain. Indeed. Klein nodded in a reserved manner before asking. What do you know of Calderon City in the spirit world? Amidst clicking sounds, a piece of illusory white paper exited the radio transceiver in a hesitant manner. I can't see that city too clearly. I do not know its exact state, but I can confirm that a saint had perished in there before. There were also certain angels, travelers, and spirit world creatures who had once entered to explore it and left it alive in a relatively smooth manner. However, none of them got much out of it. Also, I know the origins of that city. Without waiting for Klein to press, more illusory white paper spat out amidst clicking sounds. Its former name was the City of the Dead. It was a grounded divine kingdom of the ancient goddess, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace. Ever since that ancient goddess opened up the underworld, her divine kingdom was moved there. The City of the Dead gradually became the holy grounds of her descendants and believers. Before Gregrace was heavily injured by the ancient sun god and had the city uprooted and thrown deep into the spirit world, none of its citizens ever came out again. The name Calderon originates from the Abraham family's angel, the first person who stepped in. In the language of the dead, it means unknown soul. Chapter 9:21 Politeness. First, when it came to the understanding of ancient gods, Klein knew as much as many high-sequence beyonders. After all, he had the City of Silver who had continued on from the Second Epoch to this day behind him. The corresponding myths that were passed down the ages had left plenty of influence. Based on what he knew, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace was a so-called ancient goddess. Because of the City of Silver's creator, the ancient sun god who eventually ended up being consumed by the kings of angels dealt heavy damage to her. Eventually, she perished towards the end of the Second Epoch. However, her influence had yet to dissipate to this day. Signs of her existence remained because she was the founder of the underworld. City of the Dead. Unknown soul. Ancient goddess. It sounds very dangerous. Klein looked at the radio transceiver in front of him and fell silent. Tap. 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 Another piece of illusory white paper spat out. Apart from that, I'm unsure of the rest. Great Master, I have a suggestion. Would you like to hear it? That's a nice question. Klein reined in his thoughts and nodded gently. Speak. The clacking of the radio transceiver became increasingly brisker as a new line of text quickly appeared on the illusory white paper. Regarding Calderon City, you can ask Red Light Ir Moria. I still have to ask Red Light in the end. Klein nodded slightly and switched to asking, is there any danger if I were to remove Admiral Hell Ludwell's mask? No. A decisive answer appeared before Klein's eyes. That's good, he thought and said, let's end it here for today. Great Master, wise Master, in another 1 or 2 minutes, a gaze will be cast here. Your loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, will await your next summoning. Goodbye. The radio transceiver began tapping without any hesitation. Another 1 or 2 minutes. Why didn't you say so earlier? Klein was alarmed as though he was seeing a countdown timer on a bomb. He hurriedly used the altar and material he had yet cleared to set up a sacrificial ritual. He then threw the radio transceiver above the grey fog. After doing all of this and confirming that there weren't any anomalies around him, Klein made Ludwell walk to the side and not face him directly as he took off the silver mask. Gloomy pale white light spewed out, but it wasn't as exaggerated in his battle between Klein and Ludwell. It only enveloped a small region like an extinguishing candle. Meanwhile, as the radio transceiver had been sent above the gray fog, the gloomy, cold feeling that had disappeared in the nearby forest appeared again. Furthermore, it had an indescribable sense of horror that struck at the heart. This reminded Klein of a cemetery and the legendary underworld. After waiting a few seconds, seeing that there weren't any additional abnormal developments, he made his other marionette, Winner Enzo, to circle to Ludwell's front and carefully observe the face that had been masked for extended periods of time. The face lacked flesh, its skin clung tightly to his bones without any colors. It was as translucent as crystal. Beneath the crystal, transparent and indescribable shadows quickly flowed out, at times fusing with the skull, and at other times they shrank in gaps, surfacing on his teeth. Compared to the first 1 or 2 months of his transmigration, Klein would have been shocked by Admiral Hell's appearance, but now, having already seen all kinds of odd rampagers and mutated bodies, he wasn't shocked by such looks. After another round of research, Klein completely figured out Ludwell's condition. All of this stemmed from the unique traits of him being a gatekeeper. At Sequence 5, after becoming gatekeeper, Beyonders could use their bodies as cages that belonged exclusively to the underworld, allowing them to contain a certain number of souls, deceased, and natural spirits. As such, they obtained all kinds of unique powers with powerful helpers. There was no need to bring a huge undead army around in an eye-catching manner. This was the origin of many folk tales. Another purpose of a gatekeeper was an ancient role, to guard the underworld in their bodies, preventing the souls contained within from escaping, and to use them. This similarly had the symbolism of a pair of double illusory doors. And after ancient death, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace created the underworld. It was bestowing a small amount of the Death Pathway's authority to all gatekeepers. This made Beyonders of this sequence receive an enhancement in strength. The reason why Ludwell kept wearing the mask was because he had contained a powerful underworld creature in him. On the one hand, this creature could be used by him, and on the other hand, it was eroding his body, turning him into a half-human, half-dead existence. At the same time, ultimately, this creature was innately connected to the underworld. It was attempting to open the door and return. This was a combination of a gatekeeper's own powers and authority, and with the augmentation from Death's Ring, it allowed Admiral Hell Ludwell to enlarge the door to the underworld, allowing him to steer the Black Tulip directly inside. Half-human and half-dead form. No wonder Ludwell dares to enter the underworld. A real living person probably can't survive a second inside. Yes, that underworld creature gives his body some traits of a dead soul, allowing him to extract the spirit bodies of others remotely. I had suffered from that back then. Klein thought in enlightenment as he made Ludwell wear the silver mask again. The mask's purpose was to placate the soul. It allowed the underworld creature in Ludwell's body to be in a relatively calm state most of the time. After resolving his puzzlement, Klein cast his gaze back onto the altar. He wanted to attempt to contact one of the spirit world's 7 lights. In this aspect, there were special secret deed rituals and the corresponding spirit channeling ritual he could choose from. After some consideration, Klein chose the latter. This was because a secret deed ritual required him to open up his mind and spirit, allowing the targeted existence to make contact and thus obtain certain knowledge, strength, help, and a spiritual experience. This also meant that his body's thoughts and secrets were open to that existence. And through the spirit channeling ritual, there were 2 types, direct communication and praying for a soul fall. As the spirit world's 7 lights were extremely lofty existences, Klein couldn't guarantee a response based on the ritual's request. Therefore, although he wished to communicate remotely via spirit channeling, he had to make preparations for a soul fall to show his sincerity. Lighting 3 candles and dripping liquids like mint essential oil, Klein specially took out a paper figurine and placed it on the altar for the vessel for the soulfall. If there wasn't anything similar, the supplicating target would soul fall onto him, just like how Danitz had requested Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina's soul fall back then. There were also two scenarios. First, the possessed body would lose all their senses, and they would have the corresponding existence control a certain part of their body so as to facilitate providing a question and answer. The simplest example was one using the mouth to speak while the other controlled a hand to write. Klein quickly completed the first part of the ritual before he took a step back, opened his mouth, and chanted in ancient Hermes, I summon in my name, I pray to communicate with the inextinguishable light of the spirit world, the embodiment of infinite knowledge, the Red who wields authority and will. The biggest difference between this spirit channeling ritual and ordinary ones was that it couldn't be directed to deities, be it the Evernight goddess or the god of knowledge and wisdom. Their honorific names couldn't appear in the ritual or else it was bound to fail. From a mysticism angle, this meant that the spirit world's 7 lights didn't serve any deity. As the words that facilitated the communication with natural spirits were said, Klein saw the 3 flames burgeon as light splattering sounds connected together as though a door of light was opening. The area around the altar suddenly turned silent and dark as pairs of unknown eyes looked over from different areas. A cold, gloomy air blew past. Apart from the 3 candles, all the items on the altar floated in midair. Among them, the paper figurine staggered straight as its surface was tainted with a thick, clean red that didn't look bloody at all. Greetings. As Klein recalled the description of the spirit world's 7 lights from some mysticism books, he spoke by following the correct way of interacting that he had concluded. He acted like he was facing a teacher. The bright red paper figurine's head moved slightly as it let out an illusory but stern voice, "Hello there." Quite polite. Indeed, spirit channeling became a soulfall. Thankfully, I made preparations. Various thoughts flashed in Klein's mind as he earnestly and politely asked, "Your Excellency Iyer Moria, I have a question I would like to ask you." "You can just call me Iyer Moria. Please go ahead and ask." The paper figurine floating in midair seemed to be competing with Klein about who was more polite. "I wish to get information on Calderon City." Klein didn't change his attitude. After all, in the Foodaholic Empire, there was a proverb, nobody will find fault with extra courtesy. The bright red, nearly transparent paper figurine pondered for 2 seconds and said, "Can I know your purpose?" Klein didn't conceal his purpose. He frankly said, "To hunt a spirit world plunderer." The paper figurine's head moved slightly. "That's indeed something that can only be found in Calderon City with ease. Elsewhere, spirit world plunderers are like a drop of water in the ocean. They are very hard to distinguish, and even I will occasionally discover them. I'm unable to lock onto them for long periods of time. A number of them are active in the core region of Calderon City. A few are scattered in the periphery. As long as you don't attempt to go too deep inside, it's actually not too dangerous. Unfortunately, due to special reasons, us 7 lights are prohibited from entering, otherwise, we could still provide you with some actual help. That's formerly the divine kingdom of the ancient goddess, Greg Race?" Klein's heart settled down as he asked as a form of confirming the answers. The bright red paper figurine said, "Yes, the ancient death wished to revive herself using this city of the dead, but she failed completely. The authority was taken by Balaam's death. However, this also makes Calderon City more dangerous because the setup left by the ancient goddess underwent an anomaly after the failure. As for what it has turned into, I'm not too sure." "Is that so?" Klein nodded indiscernibly. He raised a few questions about other matters and received a rather satisfactory answer. "Biome. Outside a house near the harbor." Alger and Katlia were patiently waiting for the people inside to finish their dinner. Chapter 9. 22 Mushrooms and fish. Looking at the lights that emitted out of the oriel window, the hooded and masked Alger was just about to ask about the details of the operation when he suddenly saw a shadow grow out of the rich darkness. It materialized as a lanky, pale, sickly young man. Bloodless Heath Doyle. Alger quickly recognized the man to be the second mate of the future. Heath didn't look at him as he directly said to Katlia, "Captain, they didn't notice anything and turned those mushrooms into cream of mushroom soup. They plan to use the prepared pan-fried fish as tonight's main course." "Excellent." Katlia removed the heavy glasses on her nose and used her eyes, which had a mysterious purple hue, to look through the neighboring house's dining hall across the walls. Heath Doyle didn't speak further as his body instantly darkened and returned to the shadows. It was unknown where he had slunk to. After hearing their conversation, and combining it with what Ma'am Hermit had previously mentioned, Alger had a rough idea of the core element to tonight's operation: mushrooms. Poisonous mushrooms. Although he didn't know what method Admiral of Stars was using to cause the spiritual intuition of the Beyonders inside to be ineffective and not be able to distinguish normal mushrooms from poisonous mushrooms, Alger believed that there was nothing impossible in mysticism. He hesitantly said, "Will this cause Artisan Sylph's death?" Unaffiliated artisans were rather rare, so Alger didn't wish to lose such a friend if there was still room for turning things around. To him, the best case was to imprison the fellow and make him the exclusive artisan for both him and the hermit. "No." Katlia calmly shook her head as she explained, "Be it from the information you gave and the observations of my crew, there's one point to take note of: Sylph doesn't like fish, and he even hates it. This might have to do with him getting a fish bone stuck in his throat when he was young. And it was because of this matter that Katlia ultimately chose the mushroom strategy. This could effectively reduce the enemy's effective strength while allowing their side to minimize any risks. The dark environment bred mushrooms that devoured flesh and blood and were the first to be eliminated by Admiral of Stars because they could let Beyonders with sharp spiritual perception sense something amiss. This was akin to facing something poisonous. In addition, Beyonders who believed in the primordial moon had a rather deep understanding of herbs, plants, and fruits. Relying on visual observation, they were likely able to identify mushrooms that posed danger. To trick them, the only way was for the food to be harmless itself. Only through its contact with something else did a mutation occur. Based on this, the mushrooms previously created by Frank were perfect. If the two conditions of fish and water weren't met, the mushrooms were ordinary mushrooms. They could neither poison a person to death or cause diarrhea. It would be digested bit by bit and be broken down into its different components before being expelled by the body. At this point, any more fish and water was useless. For this, Cadley especially got Frank to temporarily abandon his experiment and had obtained a batch of mushrooms. She also promised to hunt an Aurora Order Rose Bishop for him. "Hates fish," Alger whispered, feeling like he couldn't keep up with the hermit's thought process. He had clearly asked if the poisonous mushrooms could cause Artisan Sylph's death, but the answer he received was that the artisan wouldn't die because he didn't like fish and even hated it. Is there some connection between the two? Alger questioned inwardly in puzzlement, but he didn't say it out loud. He maintained his silence and planned to observe more and take note. After a while, there were screams from inside the house, followed by pangs of painful grunts and vomiting. "Begin," Katlia issued an order in an abnormally succinct manner. Her figure instantly turned transparent, turning into a sculpture formed by countless stars. The sculpture shattered instantly as bright stars surged towards the house's door and drilled through a gap. As stars gathered inside, Katlia's figure materialized. Then, she heard howling winds and sounds of collisions. The door frame shook before the door opened. Wearing a hood and mask, Alger entered the targeted building not much slower than Admiral of Stars. He swept his gaze and quickly took in the situation at the dining hall. Artisan Sylph was retreating from the table with a look of horror. On the ground were two men and a woman who were constantly vomiting mushrooms. At their chests, their clothes had ripped apart as one mushroom after another sprouted. Upon sensing someone enter, they subconsciously looked up, revealing bunches of white spores on their faces. Under his mask, Alger's face involuntarily twitched. Although he was experienced and knowledgeable, and with him being a beyonder who had his fair share of experience seeing horrifying scenes, such a scene still left a striking visual and mental impact on him. Cadlia had expected it, but she had never expected such a harrowing sight. After a moment of surprise, she held her right hand to her mouth and blew a whistle. Illusory ropes emerged from the ground and coiled around the three primordial moon believers like snakes. "Is there a way to stop this?" Cadlia said to the shadow in the corner. After a moment of silence, Heath Doyle's voice sounded. Frank said that he hadn't obtained a way to stop it in his experiments. "The only way is cremation." "Cremation?" Cadlia's brows quivered. Immediately, she took out some powder from a pocket and threw them out. The powder seemed to have a life of their own as they accurately landed on the three primitive believers and the various mushrooms. Silently, they burst into scarlet flames and silently burned whatever they touched. Artisan Sealf was already dumbstruck from witnessing the mutation. When someone intruded, he had thought of resisting using his mystical item, but he quickly recognized the intruder to be Admiral of Stars Cadlia. Hence, he wisely gave up and stood in his spot, waiting. He knew that he was of significant value. No matter where he went, he was not someone who would immediately be killed. Furthermore, Admiral of Stars never had any infamy to her name. Worst comes to worst, I'll just have to join the Star Pirates. Besides, this pirate admiral seems to be more beautiful than the bounty notices. She exudes a completely different air. Sealf tugged at his wolf fang necklace and forced a smile, awaiting the intruder to mention her purpose. Cadlia glanced at him and seriously observed his appearance. All she could confirm was that he was a classic example of someone from Intis, but she failed to find any similarities to Queen Mystic. The pirate admiral deliberated and said, "I had been introduced by a friend, hoping to get you to create a mystical item, but I later discovered that you were with some primordial moon believers. The three of them aren't too strong and couldn't restrain you at all. Why do you still remain here?" In this operation, Cadlia's main hypothetical enemy was actually the artisan himself. This was because she could neither kill him or control him. Furthermore, he still had many well-matched mystical items, making him a powerful enemy. Yet, things developed smoothly to her surprise. Sealf said with a smile, "They had strong ones in biome in the beginning. Using particular floral fragrances and powders, they infected me with a strange ailment, making me increasingly weaker." Cadlia casually sized him up and said, "You have already recovered, so why aren't you taking this opportunity to escape?" Alger stood by the side silently. He didn't say a word, afraid that his voice might betray him. Artisan Sealf chuckled and said, "While I was under their control, they told me that as long as I believed in the primordial moon, I could use certain rituals to treat my chronic illness. I couldn't resist the temptation and tried it, and it really succeeded. I found the feeling of being a man again." Having said that, he came to an abrupt halt, realizing that he had said too much, exposing his secret illness. This is him letting himself go too far when it comes to women, thus, slowly losing his abilities in bed? Alger chuckled inwardly. Sealf looked up and glanced at them. Seeing that no one was mocking him, he coughed slightly and continued, "It wasn't something that relied on medicine. I really recovered my young, virile state. Later, I had 2 dreams of a moon that was bloody and very enticing. I believed that I had already become a believer of the primordial moon, therefore, I didn't dare to escape." Cadlia and Alger silently exchanged gazes, simultaneously passing the death sentence on him. As long as someone truly believed in an evil god, devil, or some other secret existence, unless they were willing to continue in the faith and slowly become crazier, there was no regret. Even if they were protected by official Beyonder factions and didn't suffer any problems for prolonged periods, they might end up strangling themselves in their sleep years later. This was nearly unsalvageable, unless they earned the right to receive the blessings of a grounded angel like a pope of a major church, or if they accepted being isolated by certain sealed artifacts and live underground forever. Of course, under such situations, there were also many who did nothing and managed to live to a ripe old age before dying a natural death. However, they were mostly ordinary people, targets that the evil gods, devils, and hidden existences easily ignored. As for Xiaofan, he was a very useful artisan. Katlia didn't mention the primordial moon believers again. To her, it wasn't a big problem whether the artisan believed in an evil god. As long as he could be communicated with to reach a deal for cooperation and not go crazy from time to time, the other matters weren't something a pirate needed to be worried about. She switched topics and said, "What mystical items do you have now? I'll choose a few and leave you with the rest." Toward such a development, Artisan Xiaofan wasn't too surprised. She was a pirate, not a policewoman. Doing a heist in passing was extremely normal. For her to leave him some items was something he should earnestly thank her for. In fact, with his level and items, it was possible for him to successfully escape if he went all out, but he lacked the courage. "All right." Xiaofan took out a pair of grayish-white glasses from his breast pocket. Gargoyle glasses. As long as sight lines are met, it can cause the other party to turn numb all over as though they are being petrified. There are two negative effects. First, if one wears it and looks into a mirror, one will turn numb as well. Second, one's body will turn heavy, making one unagile. Isn't that the item I reserved? So it has already been made. Looking at the artisan, Alger couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Chapter 923 After Effects. Xiaofan didn't notice the change in Alger's eyes. He pointed at one of the cremated, primordial moon believers and said, "That cane was taken from me. It's called Word of the Sea. It can release lightning at a target. Waving it and striking it will cause it to be augmented with wind blades. Apart from that, it can also create large water spheres and corrosive rainwater. It can also allow the wielder to not be afraid of deep sea pressure. They can freely extract oxygen from the water. At the same time, it can also be used as a wand to provide flight. There are 3 negative side effects. First, it enjoys singing. Every 6 hours, it has to belt out a song. The resulting effects don't discriminate between friend or foe. Due to the different choices of songs and styles, it can make one's mind go adrift or have one's mind and soul shocked, and at other times, cause one to be irascible and be in a state of lowered reason. Of course, even without waiting 6 hours, it will also be very willing to sing if you so desire. Second, you can probably tell that it's equipped with living characteristics. Furthermore, it's one that is rather testy. It enjoys tripping, beating, or pulling the wielder downstairs when they aren't paying attention. Third, it will cause the wielder to easily be struck by lightning. Therefore, on stormy days, either don't go out or don't bring it along. This is the sealed artifact that was made from German Sparrow's ocean songster Beyonder characteristic. If he were to know that you had already made it and had allowed the primordial moon believer to take it away, you will definitely be sold to someone who is in need of you, in the form of a Beyonder characteristic. Alger looked towards the dining table and saw the black silver inlaid cane. From what he knew, regardless of whether the other negative effects were severe, mystical items with living characteristics were considered sealed artifacts. This was because there were unpredictable dangers associated with them. With Katlia and her companion not telling him that he was done, Xiaofan could only continue taking out mystical items with a glum face. This short knife is called Blade of Poison. The effects are obvious. There's no need for me to give any additional information, right? Every time it deals damage, it will add on a random poison. As for what it is, it's all luck. Its negative effects aren't too serious. It will only cause medical treatment to fail and the feeling of being drunk to accumulate within the wielder. Sylph continued introducing a few mystical items and finally heard Katlia say, "Excellent, the rest are yours." Phew. She still left me with 3. Not only did Sylph not bear a grudge, he felt deep down how nice a person Admiral of Stars was. It was as though he had suffered some psychological ailments. Katlia then turned to look at the hanged man. "You pick first." She knew that the World Gehrman Sparrow had commissioned a mystical item to be made by the artisan. Therefore, the hanged man had to first select the crazy adventurer's item first. Alger nodded and took the word of the sea and the gargoyle glasses. Then, he indicated that the rest were spoils of war. Katlia thought for a moment and said, "Pick another one. The rest will be mine." She wasn't too interested in the remaining mystical items because she had 2 rather powerful items that suited her. She had also obtained the Scales of Luck and Judge button later, thus, covering all her bases. Under such a situation, the stacking of negative effects was something to be considered. Unless it was something extremely special, it wasn't something she would take a second look or choose to exchange. Of course, as a pirate admiral, she never found mystical items too excessive. After all, she had to hand over some of them to the Moses ascetic order and leave the rest to reward her crew. Alger fell silent for a moment. Starting from what items and beyonder powers he had, he chose the Blade of Poison. Following that, Katlia instructed Bloodless Heath Doyle to move the mystical items that Sylph had placed on the ground, and the remnant items left by the Primordial Moon Believers, out of the room. Then, she looked at the artisan with her dark purple-hued eyes. "Why do the Primordial Moon Believers want to control you?" Sylph's eyes flickered. "Isn't that simple and obvious? To get me to make mystical items for them." Just as he said that, his heart skipped a beat as a result of the purple eyes that were coldly looking at him. He hurriedly added, "They also seem to have some plan that needs the help of an artisan. As for what it is, I've no idea because it hasn't started." Katlia retracted her gaze while seemingly in thought. Exchanging a silent look with the hanged man, they nodded simultaneously. They decided not to take away the artisan today and to leave him there to monitor the subsequent developments. In other words, they wanted to figure out the Primordial Moon Believers' plans for monitoring him. Actually, for the hermit and the hanged man, whatever the Primordial Moon Believers were plotting wasn't something they cared about. They just each had matters they were concerned about. The former used it to communicate with Queen Mystic to provide her reference material for her strategies in the supernatural world. The latter could use this matter to earn contribution points from the church, therefore, they had instantly come to a tacit agreement to investigate deeper. Of course, Alger always believed in a principle: the more information he wielded, the more benefits he could obtain from various matters. After a brief silence, Katlia said to Artisan Sylph in the same tone, "Since you're already a Primordial Moon Believer, taking you with me provides me with no benefit." Sylph nodded immediately, agreeing with what she said. Katlia paused for a moment before she said, "However, I wish to establish a long-term working relationship with you. Therefore, I need a few drops of your blood. This will aid me in finding you at any time." Sylph wore a miserable look as his lips quivered, but he was unable to object to it. Phew. He suddenly exhaled and said, "Okay." With that said, he picked up a paper cutter beside him and sliced his forearm, letting a few drops of blood drip out. Katlia immediately raised her right arm and gently flicked her wrist, causing the few drops of blood to float and fly towards her. After observing the blood in her palm, this pirate admiral suddenly asked, "What's your last name?" "June," Sylph replied instinctively. Katlia didn't say a word as she turned around and walked out the door. Alger followed closely behind. The room quickly turned silent as Sylph sat on the sofa. He sat there motionless for quite a while, as though he was deep in thought over the encounter, being unable to extricate himself from it. 10 minutes later, he suddenly stood up and took out a small human-shaped figurine from his inside pocket. The figurine was brass-colored, and its face was empty. Blood slowly seeped out from it and remained on its surface. Sylph hurriedly wiped the figurine's face with a handkerchief before heaving a sigh of relief. He curled the corners of his lips and silently muttered, "Thankfully I have this fate puppet. Humph, let's see how you can find me with those drops of blood. Don't even think of cursing me." In the poverty-stricken district of Byam, on a street without any street lamps. The masked and hooded Alger looked at the hermit beside him. With a deep voice, he said, "After Sylph escaped from the Church of Steam, he has been living safe and sound to this day. This means he's not a fool. For him to so easily give you the blood in such a relaxed manner without putting up any resistance means that he has the means to avoid your tracking." Besides, he didn't mention an explanation of how the primordial moon believers found him. Logically speaking, the believers definitely would have asked him for the origins of the werewolf beyonder characteristic, but Sylph hadn't mentioned Alger at all. As Katlia took out the pair of heavy glasses and wore it, she said without a change in tone, "It isn't used for tracking." Alger nodded in thought before bidding her farewell, turning into a dark alley. He made several detours and found a chance to remove his disguise before leaving Byam. After he returned to the Resistance's private harbor, he boarded the Blue Avenger. His sailors had pretty much spent most of their energy and money over the past few days. So at that moment, they were all on the ship, waiting to set off for the seas again. Upon seeing him return, one of the sailors stood up immediately and asked with a smile, "Captain, have you had dinner?" "Not yet. Make something simple for me." For the operation, Alger hadn't had a chance to fill his stomach. The sailor who also did some cooking on the side immediately replied, "All right. We got some fresh mushrooms in the forest today. How about I pan-fry it with some butter?" Alger's face twitched as he shook his head with a normal expression. "Searing a steak would do. Medium rare, a medium done." East Balam, by the periphery of a forest. With his two marionettes, Klein wasn't in a rush to leave. He entered a city and planned on getting some dyes to disguise Admiral Hell Ludwell's mask. And before that, he had other things to do. It was to seek out a helper for his exploration of the periphery of Calderon. Klein was never a lone wolf, and it was even more so the case when faced with danger. Therefore, unless he had no options, he would always invite powerhouses to provide him with help by sharing the coordinates and paying the corresponding price. He wasn't one to rashly enter. To him, being able to obtain the desired ingredient while alive was most important. "If it wasn't because I know it's impossible, I'd even wish to wait 1 to 2 weeks before I carry a baby or push a pram to head for Calderon." Klein sighed silently as he took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. Silently, Rionette Tynker with her 4 heads in hand walked out of the void. Klein deliberated over his words and said, "I plan on exploring Calderon City soon. Well, I've already obtained its coordinates in the spirit world. I'm wondering if I can hire you for your help. What would be the price?" The 4 heads in Rionette Tynker's hand spoke one after another, "Won't do, I can't enter." Chapter 924 First key factor at carrying out risky operations: can't enter. The 7 lights can't enter for some special reason. Is this a restriction Calderon City has on higher-level creatures in the spirit world? However, how does Miss Messenger know of this limitation? Has she been there before? If that were the case, I didn't even need to ask Red Light or the magic mirror. Perhaps her spiritual intuition told her that? As his mind whirred, Klein slowly and silently exhaled. He then took out a gold coin and handed it to Rionette Tynker. "I understand. Thank you for the information." After one of Miss Messenger's head bid on the gold coin and retreated into the spirit world, Klein allowed his thoughts to roam as he considered how he could find other helpers. Mr. Azik has entered a state of slumber. It's unknown when he will wake up. There's no way to wait for him. Will Oseptin is about to be born but is only a baby. He is still at a nadir. And even if Mam Hermit has a way to temporarily restore his power while he is weak, it's impossible for him to do something as trivial as being my bodyguard. Besides, once he leaves Backlund or showcases his corresponding level, there's a very high chance that he might once again be locked on by Angel of Fate Ouroboros. Get the help of a demigod from the life school of thought through this snake of fate, such as that counselor Ricardo? That will be difficult. The life school of thought is suffering an internal divide. The counselors have too many things to do. Besides, they're running all over the world with the die of probability to leave traces to divert the Angel of Fate's attention. Queen Mystic Bernadette? I'm not too familiar with her. Besides, the fool has demigods and angels under him. A blessed like Gehrman Sparrow can always find other help. Even if I claim that it's a cooperative effort, it will also expose quite significant problems. Sigh, on the surface, the fool has angels and demigods under him, but the actual situation is that at the angel and demigod side is the fool who's just photobombing them. The chief from the City of Silver? This is indeed something that could be used as a price when he makes a request, but the problem is that he's unable to leave the forsaken land of the gods. I think I should leave this opportunity for the Bizarro Bane. Those geezers of the Sanguine? There's no suitable reason, and it's very easy for me to be exposed to Lilith. Who knows who that dead ancient goddess who hasn't truly perished is? If she is actually the primordial moon in disguise, I can forget about resurrection. Klein thought of one candidate after another, but one by one, he struck them off the list. Finally, he couldn't help but sigh. When in need, friends are always in short supply. He couldn't help but think of setting up a ritual to attempt to pray to the Evernight, the Crimson for strength, to seek the blessing of the goddess, hoping that she could directly bestow him with the true soul body and powder of a spirit world plunderer, or have some archbishop, high-ranking deacon, or secret ascetic to provide him with help. Unfortunately, all he could do was muse over the idea without actually carrying it out. Although Klein was rather accepting of the Evernight goddess and wasn't against the identity of being an Evernight blessed, he still felt extremely wary. He didn't wish to rely on a deity's bestowment for everything. Besides, he suspected that similar rituals wouldn't have any effect. This was because, with his present level and strength, he had no right to raise conditions with a sequence O. If the deity was willing to give, then she would naturally give it to him. If she didn't, praying was useless. If I have the shamelessness of old Neil, I might really try it. Back then, the goddess was willing to respond to his debt payment and resolve his constipation. She dotes on her believers pretty well. Of course, there must be certain side effects. Klein recalled the past as he sighed. He decided to change his train of thought. Since he couldn't get help from friends, he considered making use of his enemies. Perhaps I can bring the Black Emperor card, Tyrant card, and the radio transceiver. I could wait at the entrance of Calderon City. As long as King of the Five Seas Nast, high-sequence beyonders of the Church of Storms, or leaders of the Rose School of Thought like Sua and the other demigods and angels rushed over, I will immediately enter that city of the dead. No, that's too explicit. King of the Five Seas Nast and the high-sequence beyonders of the Church of Storms are highly unlikely to follow me into Calderon City. Instead, they will stay outside and wait for me to come out. Abomination Sua might chase after me, but he is an angel. He wouldn't be impeded by anything in the periphery of Calderon City. I'll only be inviting trouble to myself. After repeated thought, Klein finally gave up the idea of creating chaos for his benefit. He believed that it was difficult to replicate the same situation outside Biome City from back then. It was even more so when he wasn't a high-sequence beyonder. A person who treads the edge of the abyss would fall into it sooner or later. Who else can provide me with help? Klein's gaze swept past his two marionettes as friend after friend flashed past his mind, including the members of the Tarot Club. Suddenly, he recalled something. Miss Sharon once told me that the Tudensis 2 mummy is one of the keys to her advancement ritual and is very important to her. This also means that she's about to become a demigod, sequence 4 puppet of the mutant pathway. If she succeeds, I can get her to help. We have had a good partnership. Thankfully, I chose to help her. Otherwise, I wouldn't have any hope today. As Klein reeled in poignancy, he took out paper and a fountain pen. Placing the paper on Enzo's back, he scribbled, "It's been a while since we last met. I wonder how you've been recently." As he wrote, Klein suddenly stopped. He felt the opening was too off and hypocritical. Miss Sharon is a person who restrains herself. When she writes letters, she goes straight to the point without saying anything unnecessary. I have to consider her personality and be more frank. Klein thought for a few seconds before raising the previous slip of paper. Shaking it, he made it become engulfed in scarlet flames. After a few seconds of deliberation, Klein wrote on a new slip of paper, "I've already acquired the spirit world coordinates of Calderon City. If you've already become a demigod, I wish to cooperate again to receive some help. If not, there's no need to force it. I can still find other friends." Sherlock Moriarty. After folding the slip of paper and addressing it to Ma'am Merriam, Klein took out the adventurer's harmonica again and blew it. Rionette Tynker, in her dark and complicated dress, walked out of the void as though she had never left the vicinity, appearing right in front of him. Klein handed her the folded slip of paper and a gold coin before seriously exhorting her, "Send it to Backlund, Hillston, 126 Guard Street. Throw it directly into the mailbox." "All right," one of Rionette Tynker's heads said while another head but on the letter and gold coin. Upon seeing this, Klein pressed, somewhat worried, "You haven't lost the previous map, right? Do you know which borough Hillston Borough is? Do you know where Guard Street is?" The 3 other heads which Rionette Tynker held replied, "No, I know, it's very easy to find." Klein immediately heaved a sigh of relief as he politely sent off Miss Messenger. He temporarily threw the matter of Calderon City to the back of his mind and began disguising his marionette, Ludwell. The next morning, a man, with brownish skin, light curly hair, and was dressed in a formal loan attire and a silk half-top hat, entered Tnik City that bordered a forest with his 2 servants. This was a city that mainly produced timber, rubber, and special products from the forest. There was talk in the town that a few hair-growth research centers and the complementing factories were established here. Having disguised himself as a local, wealthy man, Klein quickly found a hotel to stay in. Sitting on a reclining chair made of rattan, he observed his handiwork once again. Winner Enzo's skin was not only bronze, but it was now almost completely black. Together with his thin and soft hair, bushy brows, and dark shadowy facial outline, matched with Ballum-styled baggy, creased pants and a black and white top, he looked like a typical example of a local servant that hailed from a particular plantation manor. Admiral Hell Ludwell's rather resplendent clothes had become the same style as Enzo's. His exposed skin had clear burn marks, and his silver mask was now dyed with a uniform iron-black color. This made it look as though he had been disfigured due to a fire accident and that he was wearing a mask to hide his face, lest he scared any passers-by. After having his lunch which was served to his room, Klein heard stacked illusory prayers. Mail. Mr. Hanged Man? It's also possible it's Emlyn and Little Sunday. The transaction of the sequence 5 Beyonder characteristic of the vampire pathway is about to begin. Klein was just about to head for the bathroom to take 4 steps counterclockwise and head above the gray fog when his spiritual perception was triggered. He hurried activated his spirit vision and saw the headless Rionette Tynker appear out of the spirit world which overlapped with the real world with a letter in a head's mouth. "Miss Sharon has replied?" Klein first thanked her before receiving the letter and tearing it open to read. "Sorry, I will likely still need another 1 to 2 months of preparation. If you still need my help by then, I'll be fine with it. Sharon. 1 to 2 months. It's not like I can't wait. It's not like I've digested my marionettist potion yet. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he got a pen and some paper to reply simply, "Take your own time. There's no rush. My matter isn't urgent. I can wait." Sherlock Moriarty. After handing the letter and gold coin to Rionette Tynker and getting her to send it to Backlund, Hillston Borough, 126 Guard Street, Klein suddenly thought of a problem. During wars, scouting is necessary. How can I be rash and so careless about exploring a dangerous place like Calderon City? When Miss Sharon advances, I can head there to do some scouting and gather some intelligence without the need to take risks. For example, I can figure out exactly what restrictions there are, what kind of anomalies will happen towards death domain powers, or I can figure out whether I'm only able to enter by a fixed entrance, or if I have any way of directly returning above the gray fog from inside. After confirming all of this, I can formulate a plan and make preparations. Of course, before scouting, divination is necessary. Klein soon made up his mind and walked into the attached bathroom. Chapter 925 Choosing Clothes above the endless grayish-white fog, in the magnificent ancient hall. Klein didn't rush to do a divination. He first answered the hanged man Alger's sacrificial ritual and got the cane made from the ocean songster Beyonder characteristics to appear in front of him. Word of the Sea. This name, when transliterated to Chinese, does bring back memories. I'll just leave it at that. It's basically a weaker version of Sea God Scepter. It doesn't have demigod-level powers like lightning storm or tsunami either. There are quite a number of negative effects. As Klein recalled the hanged man's descriptions, he stroked the silver-inlaid black cane. Perhaps the mysterious space above the gray fog had naturally suppressed it, causing this Beyonder cane to not express its living characteristic. It silently lay there like it was the most common and ordinary piece of wood. Klein nodded slightly and muttered silently to himself, "Mystical item with living characteristics are really rather troublesome. But from a different angle, it means that they can be communicated with." The die of probability back then was quite a nasty fellow, but didn't it also become obedient after getting schooled? Besides, I can always have my servants hold it most of the time. Yes, winner Enzo will be most suitable. Although he already has 0 passive luck, he is still accumulating luck constantly to make preparations for that critical moment. Releasing a little bit of it wouldn't affect anything. This way, be it being tripped, thrown, or beaten, he would be able to smoothly avoid it and not garner the attention of others. On careful thought, the cane's pranks aren't completely useless. If I were to meet other marionettists, spirit world plunderers, or bizarro banes and lose my initiative and end up being initially controlled, my thoughts and actions would turn sluggish. It would be quite difficult to extricate myself from that state by myself. At this moment, if an uncontrollable cane were to suddenly hit me or trip me to the ground, wouldn't I be successfully escaping from my predicament? Sigh, if a mystical item's negative effects are used well, they can be quite a boon. Of course, in normal combat, such pranks can bring about unnecessary dangers. How it should be balanced or avoided will need repeated trial and error. As for the negative effects of easily being struck by lightning on a stormy day, Klein didn't mind. Firstly, unless he was in a special region, stormy weather wasn't common to begin with. It wasn't something that needed to be taken into consideration most of the time. Secondly, as a seer, divining the day's weather before heading out was a common act. Finally, if he couldn't avoid sudden flash storms, Klein could always give the cane to Enzo. This way, even if the lightning were to strike the winner, it would even up being attracted by a nearby lightning rod. Let's just hope I'm not that lightning rod. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he considered the most worrisome negative effect. It would belt out Beyonder singing every 6 hours. This was indiscriminate, and it was basically a huge AoE-1 attack. After some thought, Klein decided to communicate with the Word of Sea cane to reduce the frequency at which it sang, or to give prior warning before it sang. I had breakfast early today. It's almost time for creeping hunger to start its howling. In thought, Klein removed the human-skinned glove from his left palm and threw it at an empty spot in front of the junk pile. Right on the heels of that, he lifted the silver-inlaid black cane and threw it over. Then, he stirred some of the power of the mysterious space above the gray fog, creating a barrier that isolated all sound and images. He made creeping hunger and word of the sea spend time alone. After doing all of this, Klein rubbed his palms and conjured a pen and paper. He wrote down a divination statement: "My scouting of Calderon City's periphery today is dangerous." After putting down the dark red fountain pen, Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his left wrist. He let the topaz hang down over the paper in close proximity with it. After chanting 7 times in his mind, he opened his eyes and saw the topaz standing still and not spinning. This meant that the divination had failed. Calderon City's actual situation is a secret to the entire spirit world, and divination lacks a starting point. Besides, that was once a divine kingdom of an ancient goddess. There's a mutated resurrection setup left over there. It can similarly interfere with divination. Klein rolled up his spirit pendulum and deliberated in thought. I can only trust what red light said. The danger around Calderon City's periphery isn't that great. Besides, I still have marionettes. I can let them go first and confirm if that place screens the gray fog. If it can, I'll give up. If it doesn't, I'll enter myself. Klein quickly came to a decision. Without any hesitation, he waved his hand to remove the barrier he had previously created. Then, he saw the creeping hunger which had retreated to the side of the junk pile. It was propping itself up with 3 fingers while its thumb and pinky were pressing backward on Grozel's travels. It looked weak and could hardly stand. At the same time, there was a mouth in the middle of the palm. It revealed 2 illusory, white, and eerie teeth that kept gasping for air. On the other side of the barrier, the silver-inlaid black cane was on the ground. It twitched from time to time as its tip kept oozing with blue transparent water bubbles. Very good, silence at last. Upon seeing this scene, Klein muttered in gratification. Just as he said that, the word of the sea suddenly stood up. And as though it was being held, it hopped towards Klein, circling about the fool's seat and dodged elsewhere. Creeping hunger used all its 5 fingers as legs as it chased after the cane with great difficulty. Midway, it collapsed to the ground. Klein watched speechless before letting out a sigh. After fusing with Mr. A, creeping hunger seems to have a living characteristic, but this level of intelligence is way too low. It clearly grazed a wind-blessed and is capable of short-distance flight, yet, it still uses its fingers as legs to chase. After saying that, he turned his head towards the word of the sea cane which was hiding beside him. Aren't you a sequence 5 of the Sailor Pathway? What kind of mystical item are you if you can only hop on 1 leg? Seriously, are such low-level living characteristics equivalent to babies? No, a particular baby is way smarter than all of you. Klein reprimanded each of them and sighed as he said in amusement, it's not like I'm a devil. Just as he said that, the glove and cane who were still stirring froze at the same moment. They didn't dare make a sound. Klein's subsequent words were left in his throat. All he could do was reach out to pick up word of the sea and kindly and sincerely speak to it. After a friendly and frank negotiation, this silver-inlaid black cane used high-frequency swaying to gesture that it would reduce its singing to a minimum. If it really couldn't hold back, it would inform its owner. The exact manner included, but was not limited to, trembling slightly or automatically moving up a few centimeters. At the same time, it raised a request via singing, never use the hand wearing creeping hunger to hold it. Of course, if its master insisted on doing so, it didn't object to it and was happy to accept it. Better than creeping hunger. It's not too stubborn. Klein beckoned for creeping hunger and wore it on his left palm. Taking a glance at the door of summoning which had been produced from the ritual, Klein began considering the items to bring on his scouting of Calderon City. Needless to say, the two marionettes were going. They could be used as bait, to scout the path ahead, be used as test subjects, and verify any traps. They allowed a marionettist to not need to undergo too many dangerous actions, so they were definitely going. They would be wearing Enzo's Flower of Blood ring and Ludwell's Harris sword. They were all standard equipment. In addition, Klein decided to get Enzo to carry the Word of the Sea. As for himself, Klein planned on heading there as a spirit body. Once anything was amiss, he would immediately end the summoning and return above the gray fog. This way, what clothes he matched was something worth considering. Azic's copper whistle? No, that is related to death, and Calderon City belongs to ancient death. There's a small possibility that this might create a terrifying anomaly, causing the danger in the core region to automatically come out. Black Emperor card or the Tyrant card? I'll be moving about the spirit world. The two marionettes are basically dead. I'm not afraid that they have their blood extracted. Ludwell is a half-human, half-dead entity. He doesn't have blood to speak of. The value of Enzo's blood only makes him appear human most of the time. And this could be recovered by using Flower of Blood. It also means that I can bring the Sea God Scepter to Calderon City. It's a place that's deep in the spirit world. It's far from the Rorstad archipelago, so I don't have to worry about being affected by the believers' prayers. The only problem is that I'll become irascible and short-tempered. It will be easy for me to become hot-headed. This is taboo when it comes to exploring. However, this is easily resolved. I'll leave it with Enzo or Ludwell. Besides, the Tyrant card's level is very high. It can produce a suppression effect to a certain degree on the Sea God Scepter, preventing me from easily flaring up. With the combination of the Tyrant card and the Sea God Scepter, I'm equivalent to half a sequence 4. This can then most effectively reduce the risk I face. In the future, even if I were to enter with Miss Sharon, I can also equip myself in such a manner. I'll get her to maintain her state as a wraith, no, an evil spirit state to circumvent all problems. I don't have to worry about the law of convergence. If Calderon City can screen the gray fog, I'll return after taking a look from the outside. No one will lock onto me or pursue me. After all, the spirit world isn't the home ground of the Sailor Pathway. If Calderon City can't screen the gray fog, and a high-sequence Beyonder of the Church of Storms really does get drawn there, I can end up using him. Amidst his thoughts, Klein suddenly reached out his hand, attracting the Tyrant card to fall into his palm. Immediately after that, he fused the card of blasphemy into his soul body. Suddenly, extreme might and terrifying auras emanated from the fool's location. A heavy papal tiara silently appeared on Klein's head as his clothes turned into a religious robe. The latter was similar in dressing as a pope from Saint Seiya, Knights of the Zodiac, which he had seen in his previous life. However, the colors were dark blue that was almost black. As howling wind sounded, the pontiff robe flared up suddenly as Klein raised his right hand and suspended himself in midair before catching the white bone scepter that flew towards him. At the tip of the scepter, the gems emitted either blinding silver or blue light like bolts of lightning that circled around the tyrant. With a thud, the Word of the Sea cane prostrated to the ground, right beside Klein, who was wielding the scepter and dressed like a pontiff. 1. Area of effect. Chapter 926 Spiraling City. I really do feel a little irascible, but I'm not that quick-tempered. Wearing the papal tiara and dark blue robes while wielding the Sea God Scepter, Klein seriously observed his new state. This meant that the Tyrant card could suppress the negative effects of the Sea God Scepter to a certain extent, but it wasn't able to completely eliminate it. Using cogitation, Klein composed himself and turned to look at the junk pile in the corner. Grozel's Travels? This is my strongest defensive item to this day. Besides, it also has some magical uses, but the problem is that it was made by another ancient god, Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt. Based on what Little Sun said, this Dragon King was once allies with the owner of Calderon City Ancient Death, Phoenix ancestor Greg Race. Who knows if this book would trigger any unnecessary developments. To be safe, it's best if I don't bring it. And just like Azek's copper whistle, the mutated paper figurine can't be included. It has the remnant aura of artificial death. This might have a shock and awe effect when exploring Calderon City, but it also contains plenty of latent risks. The Priest of Light Beyonder characteristic? This can effectively restrain dead spirits, a natural nemesis for the City of the Dead, but it's only an ingredient that hasn't been made into a mystical item. The effects it has is rather limited. The negative effects are extremely bad. It won't be helpful to my soul state. In addition, lightning can also purify the dead. With the Sea God's Scepter and Word of the Sea, there's no need for me to bring the Priest of Light Beyonder characteristic. Thoughts flashed across Klein's mind as he eliminated the remaining items in the junk pile. He wore the human-skinned glove on his left hand, wielded Sea God's Scepter, and raised his right hand slightly. He made Word of the Sea fly up and land in his palm. Following that, the papal-dressed Klein changed the appearance of his soul. He hid his facial features within the shadows of the papal tiara. He slowly stood up as the dark blue robes fluttered in the wind, the white bone scepter dazzling. With just one step, Tyrant Klein passed through the door of summoning and walked out of the candlelight, arriving in the real world. He found himself in the rather spacious bathroom. After adding the Fate Siphon charm and Death Knell into his body, he opened the door and returned to the living room. He got Enzo to come over to receive Word of the Sea. After some thought, Klein took out Death Knell and handed it to Admiral Hell Ludwell. After doing all of this, he brought his two marionettes and relied on traveling to head for the coordinates in the spirit world that were provided by Miss Magician. The trip happened rather smoothly. The Tyrant Aura made all kinds of strange spirit world creatures not dare to approach him while en route. They didn't even dare look at him directly. Before long, Klein arrived at his destination. The scene in front of him looked no different from anywhere else in the spirit world. The saturated colors were overlapped, and there was some thin fog emanating everywhere. Elsewhere, in the depths, pairs of eyes moved away one after another. The papal robe's cape fluttered gently in the wind as Klein did a rough scan before getting Enzo and Ludwell to enter a blob of fog that appeared very thin and normal. Suddenly, his field of vision widened with the help of his two marionettes. A grand city that was of legendary proportions appeared in his eyes. This city was abnormal. It didn't develop in a vertical manner, but instead spiraled deep into the ground. It gave one the feeling of an inverted mausoleum. Its buildings had a myriad of styles, but they were equally strange. Some of them had towering pale white rock columns with a huge single house carved out at the top. Some were long and squarish, with the doors placed at the ceiling with no windows in sight. Some were built in the ground, a tombstone erected at their entrances. Some were built with white bones, messy and scattered. The closer it was to the bottom of the pit, the more completely preserved the buildings were. The closer they were to the top, the more collapsed areas there were, ones filled with the dilapidation and rot that time brought. Klein made his two marionettes stop. Despite standing at the edge of the city and overlooking everything, he was unable to identify what was at the bottom of the building. Deep darkness enveloped the area as though no light had been shown inside for thousands and thousands of years. After a brief observation, Enzo lowered his head and chanted using ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." Just as he finished the statement, Klein, who was still situated outside Calderon City, heard stacked illusory pleas. He also recognized it to be from a man with a deliberately hoarse voice. It's the marionette's prayer from before. Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he silently muttered, "This means that Calderon City doesn't screen out the gray fog." At the very least, the outer periphery doesn't. I can enter. Although he said that to himself, he was in no way in a hurry. He subsequently controlled Ludwell to raise his left palm and spread it open. Illusory light was suddenly emitted. Following that, with a point as its origin, the area imploded, forming a pair of double bronze doors. This door was slightly blurry and extremely incorporeal. The surface was covered with countless mysterious patterns that gave one the feeling of indescribable heaviness and silence. With a creak, the mysterious bronze door shifted backward and cracked open a little. Through this crack, Klein saw the deepest and heaviest darkness. Amidst the darkness, pale white colors stirred, swirling up at times and descending at other times. It was like a river that was gushing through a night devoid of light. On its two sides, pale white stone columns appeared, looking extremely identical to Calderon City's interior but in a more exaggerated manner. At this moment, pairs of transparent eyes and indescribable faces suddenly appeared. They filled the illusory bronze door's crack. Eagerly trying to pass through, Klein's eyes felt a slight stabbing pain as he immediately made Ludwell clench his left palm. Thud. The illusory door, covered in mysterious patterns, was pushed by an invisible force as it closed, disappearing from Enzo's sight. This mysterious door that separates life from death and leads to the underworld has apparently changed its course. It's no longer the underworld behind the door, but the core region of Calderon City. The deepest point at the bottom of the pit? Wearing the papal tiara while wielding the sea god scepter, Klein nodded in thought. This way, many of the powers of the death domain was remade in Calderon City, causing an anomaly. With this knowledge in mind, Klein once again got Ludwell to raise his left arm. The left part of this marionette's body rapidly turned illusory as dark green specks appeared as though he had turned into a wraith or specter. His arm began to stop abiding by the laws of reality as it suddenly extended into the distance. The center of its palm was abnormally white with an illusory face protruding from it. The face had its mouth half open as its tongue was sharp like a snake's. It was covered in white fur. In a completely surreal manner, the tongue flicked out far into the distance. It was as though it could drill directly into a human's body and absorb one's soul. Indeed, the death envoy powers Ludwell gets from the underworld creature inside his body has mutated. Not only has it been enhanced, but it has also gone from remotely extracting spirit bodies to directly consuming them. Klein stood at Calderon City's entrance and made Admiral Hell display all kinds of beyonder powers of the death domain. Through that, he gleaned the differences that there were from the usual outcome. The thing they had in common was that all of them had become more powerful. Then, Klein experimented by making Enzo use the specialness of his body and the various powers from Flower of Blood and Word of the Sea before coming up with a conclusion. Aspects in the fate domain aren't affected. Lightning strike is suppressed, making it much weaker. Unable to fly too high. Powers like wind blades, singing, illusory scales, balance, and water membrane undergo no changes. With the end of these experiments, Klein made Enzo and Ludwell walk down the pale white stairs, clinging closely to the periphery of Calderon City. The buildings there had already completely collapsed. As the 200-meter threshold approached, Klein raised his right hand and pressed down on his face that hid in the shadows of the papal tiara. Then, wielding the sea god scepter, he stepped into the thin fog. His mind instantly felt a little groggy as the scene before him changed. He had already entered the city of the dead, Calderon City. Enduring the irascible feelings within him, Klein made his left glove turn dark. His body turned illusory as it was tainted by a dark color, turning him into a shadow. Only the sea god scepter in his hand continued emitting silver or blue beams of light. Using the soul screening and the tyrant card suppression to hide the light, Klein floated diagonally ahead, slinking into the shadows of the collapsed buildings. He followed closely behind the two marionettes, beginning to perform an initial inspection of Calderon City's outer region. As he traversed the area, Klein gradually noticed something amiss. It was too quiet. It was so quiet that it was as though the entire city was dead. Even bugs had failed to survive. Based on what Erodes and Red Light Ire Moria had said, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace had uprooted Calderon City and thrown it deep into the spirit world. Before doing so, the residents inside the city were allowed to leave. Occasionally, there would be other spirit world creatures entering. But now, not only were there no active creatures in the peripheral region, there weren't even skeletons, zombies, or even one or two non-bone-like buildings. Klein tensed up more and more. With Enzo's and Ludwell's vision, he carefully observed his surroundings. During this process, his gaze swept across a broken pale white column. The ancient but damaged building at the top had a disc burnished from gold inside. The disc's smooth surface reflected a figure, but it wasn't Enzo, but Klein in his papal tiara and dark blue robe. This Klein had a gloomy demeanor. His face was pale and his eyes were listless as though he had long been dead. Chapter 927 Tyrants Might Hiding in the Shadows. Klein's heart tightened. He then quickly calmed down without showing any signs of horror. This was because he was extremely certain that the reflection on the golden disk's smooth surface wasn't him, at least, it wasn't the real him. If it really was him, Enzo would have seen the gray fog, seeing magical scenes that resembled a mythical creature form. This would have caused Klein to faint immediately. Since I'm completely fine, it means that the reflection isn't of me. Klein activated his spirit body thread's vision, controlled Enzo, and raised word of the sea. He approached the pale white collapsed column and the ancient building which remained in shambles while secretly releasing some of his luck. The swarthy marionette approached the golden disc one step at a time. Bending his back and raising the cane, he carefully observed the area. The disc had two layers, an inner and outer layer. The core region was as smooth as a mirror with very few patterns. The boundaries were engraved with bird-like creatures. Its entirety had an ancient magnificence to it. The figure it reflected remained the same. Despite reflecting Enzo, it reflected the gloomy, pale Klein with listless eyes. Even the sea god scepter, the papal tiara and papal robe that came with the tyrant card weren't missing. If it wasn't because of the lack of the gray fog, Klein definitely would have imagined that the disc could influence himself through a marionette and spirit body threads. Or perhaps it would be like what the Saint of Darkness back at the ruins of the Battle of Gods had encountered, having himself dissociate without realizing it. What does this actually mean? Klein calmly grew out of the shadows, restoring his appearance back when he first stepped into Calderon City. Then, using his Beyonder powers as a clown, he produced his present state in his mind. Holding the white bone scepter with embedded blue gems, he wore a caped papal robe with a papal tiara with different gems dotting it. His face was hidden in the shadows, appearing somewhat blurry. His entire body exhibited a gloomy and cadaveric air, as though he was a zombie that was recently dug out. This. Klein was alarmed. He never expected to really experience such changes. Apart from the gray fogs mixing with reality, the reflection on the golden disc really was him. Something that it doesn't involve the gray fog, it isn't anything to worry too much about, he hurriedly consoled himself as he calmed his mental state. Normally, with Klein's rich experience and good ability to adapt, there was nothing he needed to do at the moment. But first, considering how he was holding the sea god scepter that easily made him rash, he needed to pay constant attention. Second, he knew that this was once Phoenix ancestor Gregrace's divine kingdom which contained the setup required for her revival. There was bound to be all kinds of abnormalities. Therefore, he was more nervous than ever before. Getting Ludwell to return, he used his Beyonder powers to do a thorough inspection of himself before gaining a preliminary understanding. When living creatures enter Calderon City, they will naturally transform into the deceased. This is similar to the underworld, but there's a fundamental difference. Here, living creatures won't die an abrupt death before slowly turning into mindless undead creatures. instead, they will directly turn into dead spirits. I didn't notice it before because Enzo and Ludwell are essentially dead, so there's no need for them to be converted. Erodes and Red Light Ire Moria didn't mention this because the travelers, spirit world creatures, and angels automatically recovered after leaving alive? This kind of transformation is unable to affect the powers of the gray fog that fuses with reality. And the disc reflects the dead me, not all of me, or the me that has had some interaction with Calderon. Klein was more inclined to believe in the latter, but he wasn't too sure. At this moment, he heard a sound coming from nearby. Clang! 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 The sound was heavy but crisp, as though someone was striking metal heavily. Klein wasn't in a hurry to react. He carefully listened for 2 seconds before letting Enzo put down the heavy golden disc and walk towards a nearby broken tombstone. The halved tombstone corresponded to a building that developed further underground. On top of it were the words written with the language of the dead, a quick-tempered fellow, one who died as a result of comparing which was harder, his head or someone else's hammer. Enzo circled around the damaged tombstone and arrived at the entrance to the tomb. He reached out his left hand and turned the knob, pulling open the door. Amidst the rough grinding sounds of rust, the heavy door slowly opened. So. Pale white beams of arrow-like light flew out. They brushed past Enzo's face, the top of his head, torso, and inner thighs and flew into the distance, stabbing into the ground before vanishing. However, Winner Enzo was completely unharmed. I have to say that such a marionette is excellent for dangerous explorations. Klein sighed inwardly as he made Enzo cast his gaze down the building. It was a blacksmith giant with bluish-black skin and a head that looked like a ruptured watermelon held onto a hammer as he kept striking an anvil, but there was nothing on it. As the giant with the cracked head had normal spirit body threads and wasn't the soul avatar of someone else, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Just as he was about to get Enzo to take a more thorough look, his body suddenly turned numb as his thoughts turned sluggish. This feeling was something he had felt before. Back in Tingen, he had been in a similar state when he was under sealed artifact 2-049's influence. Klein didn't know better back then, but after becoming a marionettist, he knew that this meant that his spirit body threads had been controlled by the sealed artifact. This also meant that someone was controlling his spirit body threads. Furthermore, the difference from before was that, not only were his joints rusting as though someone had infused glue into them, he also felt a strong numbness as if he had been struck by lightning. It made his actions become harder. No good. It's the spirit world plunderer. I was guarded against its use of soul avatar. It distracted me, and secretly approached, but I never expected that it not only had a soul avatar, but it also has a partner. That giant blacksmith made me careless. And the marionette's existence made me ignore my own safety. Various thoughts emerged in Klein's mind involuntarily as it disrupted his normal thoughts of trying to save himself. At this moment, the giant blacksmith with a ruptured head raised his hammer and rushed over to Enzo, hoping to smash him into a pulp. And by Klein's neck, there was a cold wind blowing at it, pricking his hair up one by one. The surroundings were abnormally silent before, but now, all kinds of strange creatures emerged from the pale white stone column, run-down houses, and the tombstone's tomb. Some of them only had half a body. Others were transparent and nearly invisible. Some were stretched and soft like noodles. Some had a ruptured chest with bloody innards. Some had dark green faces that resembled that of an evil spirit. Others had eyes growing everywhere around their body. There were also others who looked like jellyfish that lived in the air. Countless gazes were cast onto Klein from different areas. They were without any feelings, just indifferent. At this moment, Klein opened his mouth with great difficulty as he said a word slowly, "Sing." Just as he said that, the glove on his left palm opened its mouth, revealing its white teeth, "Praise you." The Lord that created everything, the Lord who reigns behind the curtain of shadows, the degenerated nature of all living things. Amidst this jarring voice that resembled blackboard scratching sounds, Enzo, who had been thrown to the ground, successfully avoided the hammer's strike as word of the sea began spewing out water bubbles in excitement. Break! 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 Klein suddenly felt his head ache as his ability to think was instantly recovered, no longer having disconnected thoughts for a brief moment. However, his body remained rusted as his body was filled with numbness. Following that, he relied on his spirituality while motionless, controlling Ludwell, who had returned to his side, to punch him with his left fist. Bang! Klein staggered back, instantly extricating himself from the numb and sluggish state. Then, wearing the papal tiara, he became hot-headed as he spread his papal cape and raised sea god scepter. The blue gems lit up one after another as a bright silver bolt of lightning blasted down. The bolt of lightning spread into branches, blanketing Calderon City's periphery for hundreds of meters with a lightning forest. The destructive aura and sense of destruction were brought to the forefront. The strange creatures that had charged out from various spots shattered, evaporated, and completely vanished as a result of the swath of silver. Moments after the silver storm quelled, Tyrant Klein's sea god scepter emitted a blinding light once again. The rapturous bolts of lightning snaked, embroiled the area, smiting down again and again like a huge wave. After 2 repeated casts of lightning storm, Klein was exhausted as he found his calm again. His heart beat suddenly as he recalled something. Lightning storm was indiscriminate when it struck. Apart from the sea god scepter wielding him and the partner who stood beside him, everything else suffered a decimating blast. This also meant that Ludwell was still fine, but there was a high chance of Enzo being wiped out. Klein instinctively looked over and saw Enzo curled by the side of the halved tombstone. Behind him was the huge metallic hammer which still had tiny bolts of lightning snaking around. Not far from it was 2 non-human charred legs. The tomb corresponding to the tombstone had already collapsed. The iron-black tiles that landed on the ground still had remnant silver bolts of lightning sizzling away. As expected of a winner. He didn't even die despite such an onslaught. The amount of luck he accumulated has probably been passively expended. Klein felt relieved as he activated his spirit-body thread's vision to observe his surroundings. He was searching for the spirit world plunderer. He believed that the range of a spirit world plunderer's controlling of spirit-body threads couldn't match that of a lightning storm. The already dilapidated buildings had nearly been leveled. The remaining stone pieces and bones were mostly charred black. Even the heavy golden disc was in shambles. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the rubble more than 100 meters away from Klein. It was wearing a translucent white robe. It didn't have a head or limbs. It appeared like it was being propped up by an invisible person. At that moment, it looked like it was in a sorry state, with wounds and black marks everywhere. This is the spirit world plunderer, I suppose. My rash usage of 2 lightning storms seems to have restrained it. Upon seeing this scene, Klein had such thoughts flash through his mind. Chapter 928 Misdirection. At his point, Klein had roughly understood the situation. Due to the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence, he had been targeted by the spirit world plunderer the moment he entered Calderon City, which didn't even have ordinary dead spirits. It first moved the golden disk of unknown origins to the predicted path, allowing his marionette to see it while walking past. As such, his attention was transferred to the transformation effect Calderon City had on the living. Following that, it used the giant blacksmith, which wasn't its sole avatar, to distract him further. Finally, it secretly arrived within control distance and achieved success in one try. If it wasn't because I had seen those deceased bodies that are hung up like wind chimes at the cathedral, thus having an instinctual fear of high-sequence beyonders of the seer pathway, and having prepared several autonomous means to disrupt any exertion of control over me, I might have already been made a soul avatar by the spirit world plunderer. Seriously, I should have thought of the law of beyonder characteristic convergence before I came in. After carrying the sea god scepter, even with the tyrant card suppressing it, I'm still a little too rash. I nearly missed out on such a crucial detail. On the surface, I did seem as cautious as I usually am, but in fact, I had turned rash without realizing it. Yet, I didn't even believe I was being rash. Klein's thoughts raced before he raised the bone scepter-wielding arm and continued using lightning storm. If once wasn't enough, make it twice. If that still wasn't enough, do it a third time. In short, he had to take this opportunity to prevent the spirit world plunderer from escaping from the range of his attacks. This was the safest method, and it was also Klein's fighting style that he looked up to the most. If it wasn't because Lightning Strike had been greatly weakened in Calderon City, he even suspected that he could have gone over to pick up the Beyonder characteristic already. And having already digested most of the Sequence 5 potion, his spirituality was sufficient enough for him to deal out such damage for a while. At this moment, the invisible figure wearing a translucent white robe burst into pale white flames. It appeared in midair several hundred meters away. The spirit world plunderer had used flaming jump, which was many times stronger than Klein's version, instantly pulling away from him. At the same time, in the rubble it was hiding in, a 4-meter-tall bluish-black giant staggered to his feet. The giant's chest was open, but there weren't any innards. However, it stood like a castle, standing in between the tyrant and the spirit world plunderer, blocking Klein's line of sight. And in Klein's eyes, its spirit body threads were gathered together, extending far towards the spirit world plunderer. It was obvious that it was a soul avatar. At the tip of the sea god scepter, the blue-colored gems lit up. A few bolts of lightning leapt out of thin air, mixing together into a huge silver arrow. Instantly, it smote the bluish-black giant's head. All the invisible defenses shattered, and like papier-mâché, the giant's head cracked. Countless bits of charred flesh splattered as his headless body evaporated amidst white gases that were tainted with dark green spots. All his vitality was robbed away. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. Klein, in his papal tiara and papal robe, raised the bone scepter even higher. The blue light radiated in ripples as howling wind blew up his cape. In a very large area of Calderon City's periphery, dark clouds quickly gathered. Under a suppressive layer, they made the area appear darker and more repressed. Smack! 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 Bean-sized drops of water smashed to the ground, releasing dust that had accumulated over time. Splash! The raindrops pattered at an increasing pace, forming a catastrophic storm. The water extinguished the pale white flames and formed a stream that gushed downwards towards the lowest point of the city, right for the end of the deep pit. In such weather, Klein's flaming jump had been made ineffective, but it was likewise for the spirit world plunderer. However, to a tyrant, his spirituality could spread through the dark clouds as though he had transformed into a deity that overlooked the land. Every dark cloud, every drop of water had become Klein's eyes. They allowed him to easily find the spirit world plunderer in every area that had its weather change. This invisible figure with the translucent white robe was hiding behind a broken pale white column. It hadn't left the periphery for the core region. Boom! A deafening boom sounded as bolts of lightning meshed to form a silver beam that shot out from the dark clouds, right at the spirit world plunderer. Relying on its potent spiritual premonition, the invisible figure burrowed into the ground half a second early. 3 thick silver beams smote the area one after another, melting the soil away as they sank downwards, producing charred craters. The spirit world plunderer emerged from another spot as it hurriedly dodged, keeping to the right at times and left at other times, as though it was carrying out a snaking dodge maneuver. However, regardless of where it fled to, the silver beams would chase up to it. They even blocked its path ahead of time, preventing it from attempting to leave the stormy region. Boom! 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 The deity akin to a tyrant, who looked down from the dark clouds at the spirit world plunderer, waved his scepter and struck down again and again at his target, with success barely eluding him several times. Klein turned more and more anxious, eager to immediately end the hunt. Hence, he unreservedly triggered the sea god scepter to increase the frequency at which bolts of lightning struck down. Suddenly, he felt a strong sense of exhaustion. This alarmed Klein, for he realized that something was amiss. The spirit world plunderer had the chance of retreating deeper into Calderon City at the beginning, so why is it staying around? It's clearly a spirit world creature without a physical body. It can burrow underground to avoid the lightning and a tyrant's notice, so why is it circling around from time to time? It's trying to make me attack. It has noticed that I'm not a demigod through my spirit body threads and my control over my marionettes. It wishes to drain me of my spirituality. Klein was alarmed. Combining it with his original encounter, he came to a realization of how intelligent the spirit world plunderer was. It was a rather crafty creature. At the same time, he also thought of a problem. Could lightning storm and the stormy rain attract the notice of dangerous existences in the core region of Calderon City? I'm too rash. I keep neglecting the critical details. As thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein put away the sea god scepter. The heavy storm stopped as the dark clouds quickly scattered, the weather restoring to normal. Klein made Enzo return to his side with word of the sea, and he got Ludwell to protect him in the middle. Following that, he and his two marionettes walked out as though they were trying to leave Calderon City while he still had some spirituality left. During this process, Klein had his spirit body threads vision constantly activated to prevent the spirit world plunderer from approaching him. He noticed that this creature's spirit body threads were somewhat special. A portion of them came out from its body and extended outwards normally. A number materialized externally and were bound together in a thick bundle, right into the translucent white robe. Klein suspected that this was the state when a spirit world plunderer controlled a soul avatar, making it different from a marionettist. As he shifted his gaze, he suddenly saw thin black illusory threads coming out from a collapsed house. A portion of them gathered into a thick bunch with its source in the distance. Klein didn't hesitate to raise his sea god scepter, creating a sonorous thunderclap. Boom! Amidst this sound that struck awe into one's mind and spirit, Ludwell suddenly raised his left hand. Half his body instantly turned illusory as his arm extended out extensively, heading straight for the collapsed house. Midway, his palm turned abnormally pale white. An illusory face protruded out and stuck out with a snake-like tongue which had white fur covering its surface. The tongue reached out far, penetrating the wall and stabbing at the spot where the spirit body threads were gathered. It immediately sucked on a distorted and blurry soul. Around the soul, a number of spirit body threads suddenly disappeared as though they never existed. A portion of them was none other than the gathered bundle, the ones that came from afar. They were fake. The spirit world plunderer was able to create fake, illusory spirit world plunderers or instantly swap location between the soul avatar and itself. Klein suddenly turned his head and looked elsewhere. Indeed, he saw a blob of spirit body threads swim over from underground at a fast speed. He once again used Sea God's scepter, releasing a thunderclap close to the ground, one that could awe his spirit body. Meanwhile, Enzo expended some of his remaining luck, adding bad luck to the target. Then, he shot out a silver bolt of lightning from the tip of the Word of the Sea. The bolt of lightning rather luckily passed through a crack and entered the ground, striking the assailant directly. It caused a portion of the spirit body threads to instantly vanish. It was also fake. Just as Klein reacted, his thoughts paused and his body turned numb. Just as he opened his mouth with great difficulty to instruct the mystical item, the invisible figure in the translucent robe descended from above, landing right before him. The spirit world plunderer had been hiding high in the sky, cloaking itself with the grayish-white clouds. The moment this invisible figure appeared, maggots began crawling out of its collar where its head should be. They were maggots with strange patterns covering them. Just one look at them sent his mind reeling. Although he broke out of the control of his spirit-body threads, he also lost his ability to think. His face that was shadowed by the papal tiara began to grow meat tendrils. Each tendril was relatively transparent, like squirming worms. If it wasn't for the tyrant card's level supporting him, he would have fallen to the ground while struggling in pain. The spirit world plunderer had a mythical creature form to a certain extent. At this moment, the invisible figure inside the white robe began to control Klein's spirit-body threads without any obstacles in the way. In a few seconds, it was already close to succeeding. Seeing that its prey was about to become its sole avatar, the spirit world plunderer suddenly saw its target open his mouth with great difficulty and say a word. He had recovered from the state of nearly losing control faster than it had anticipated. And the word was in ancient Hermes, fate. It was the incantation for the fate siphon charm. If Klein really wanted to leave, he would have grabbed his two marionettes and directly ended the summoning to return above the gray fog. He wouldn't have walked to Calderon City's entrance. He was planting a trap for the spirit world plunderer. The reason why he could recover so quickly from the injuries dealt to him by a mythical creature form, and why he was able to chant the relevant word, was because he had experienced such situations too many times. Besides, although he wasn't sure what method his opponent was using, there was definitely a rather well-rounded way to deal with it, make his target unlucky. Just as Klein entered a sluggish state, his first reaction wasn't to make the mystical item sing, but to let Enzo expend all his luck, making the spirit world plunderer have enough bad luck. Chapter 929 True Soul Body, Fate. As the dragged-out and abstruse ancient Hermes term resounded, the spots where the spirit world plunderer and Klein stood suddenly darkened. It wasn't very obvious, as though a cloud had drifted over in midair without stopping. But when this illusionary shadow dissipated, the invisible figure that was donning a translucent white robe stood frozen on the spot. The surface of its clothes showed signs of worms crawling across it. It was sluggish, slow, and in a dire state. Across it, Klein's eyes had their lucidity return. The meat tendrils on the shadowed face beneath the papal tiara vanished. It appeared as though it wasn't the spirit world plunderer who had controlled Klein's spirit-body threads and nearly succeeded. Instead, it appeared as though Klein was the one who was controlling it and had nearly converted it into his marionette. The fate siphon charm switched one's fate. This was a high-level charm made using a worm of time. It could siphon off the target's subsequent fate, and in a short period of time, burden it with that of the target's, so as to complete an exchanging of fates. Therefore Klein and the spirit world plunderer situations had switched. One went from death to survival, while the other went from victory to instant despair. After confirming that the spirit world plunderer was intelligent and extremely difficult to deal with, making it difficult to hunt it, Klein began putting on an act of retreating. He appeared rash as he deliberately walked into the spirit world plunderer's control, enticing its actions, ready to use the fate siphon charm at the critical moment. That way, what terrible acts the spirit world plunderer did to its enemy, the charm would then allow it to experience the same despair. Of course, if the fate siphon charm didn't have the expected effect, or if the spirit world plunderer's main soul didn't appear and had ended up using other means to control the situation, Klein still had his last trick up his sleeve to protect himself, directly end the summoning and return above the gray fog. He would sacrifice his two marionettes and a few mystical items in order to ensure his own safety. Without the time to marvel at how magical the fate siphon charm was, or how terrifying angels from the Marauder pathway were, Klein didn't hesitate to raise the sea god scepter high up before the swapping of fates ended. The dark blue papal robe flared up with the wind as the golden papal tiara emitted meshed blue and silver beams of light. At the tip of the white bone scepter, it shot out bolts of lightning that gathered into a ball before landing on the spirit world plunderer's body. A swath of silver color brightened up immediately, inundating the target, turning the surroundings white. Once, twice, thrice. Klein continuously triggered terrifying lightning balls, expending his spirituality without holding back. Finally, he heard a roar that seemed to stem from the depths of one's soul as he instinctively sensed that his target had collapsed and dissipated. Only then did Klein lower the sea god scepter and watch the silver lightning sizzle away. At that moment, his entire spirit body had turned rather illusory. Even with the tyrant's augmentation, it didn't seem real. As the lightning dispersed, the invisible figure in the white translucent robe appeared once again in Klein's sight. Flickering light emerged from within as the spirit world plunderer's body cracked, turning into countless illusory bubbles that disintegrated bit by bit. The tyrant had succeeded in the hunt. At this moment, deep within Calderon City, there was a sudden quake. It was as though a massive creature had awoken as a result of the spirit world plunderer's death, or that countless dangerous creatures were surging out. The indescribable feeling combined into a swath of illusory grayish-white and, like a tidal wave, rose up from the bottom. Other spirit world plunderers? No, it appears to be a more terrifying and horrible creature. A being that the spirit world plunderer attends to? Also, in Calderon City's core region, at the end of the deep pit, it's still as silent as ever. There's no sound at all, making it more horrifying. Klein pumped himself up as he diverted some attention in order to monitor the situation inside Calderon City as he anxiously waited for the spirit world plunderer's characteristic to appear to form an ingredient. He wasn't relishing in the delight of a successful hunt but was pacing about anxiously at the edge of the abyss. During this process, Klein got Enzo and Ludwell to stay close to him. He threw the sea god scepter to the former so as to escape the state of irascibility. He began considering how to deal with the subsequent development with a clear mind, as well as consider whether he had missed out on some other details. As the thoughts flashed in his mind, Klein suddenly recalled something. Back when he made the mystical item sing, Creeping Hunger had praised the true creator and had used his complete honorific name. Although the human-skinned glove had used Hermes instead of ancient Hermes or other languages that could stir the powers of nature, the former was still usable when it came to sacrifices. This also meant that the true creator might have very well heard Creeping Hunger's praises and noticed the commotion here. Apart from the rising grayish-white tide and the terrifying creature deep down in the city, there are other dangers. Wait, I'm now a spirit body, equivalent to a wraith. I'm not in my normal state. Just as Klein's mind thought of something, his spiritual perception was triggered as he instinctively cast his gaze at the entrance to Calderon City. The lights there flickered as a figure entered. The figure was wearing a simple and ordinary linen robe with a head of silver hair. He was a handsome man with soft facial features. His eyes were gentle with some hints of coldness. It was as though he was observing the fates of everyone in the world like a spectator. Behind him, there were beams forming illusory layers of pure wings. They spread outwards, blocking the entire entrance. Ili Klein nearly hissed through the gaps in his teeth as a series of titles and names flashed across his mind: Ouroboros, Tail Devourer, Angel of Fate, King of Angels. He didn't have the luxury of time to consider the possibility of his previous thought. His body expanded as though it was incorporeal, enveloping his marionettes, Enzo and Ludwell, the yet-to-appear characteristic, and the spirit world plunderer's remnant bubbles within. At this moment, Ouroboros's silver eyes already had the distant figure in his sights. It was a figure wearing a papal tiara and a dark blue robe, exuding extreme oppression and tyranny. There was a grayish-white fog that had been blurred by the tyrant's aura. A river of flickering light appeared in his eyes, seeming to circle the tyrant figure and the periphery of Calderon City. Silently, the square houses and the pale white columns stood up again despite being destroyed by the lightning storm from before. The charred legs of the giant blacksmith once again possessed a body as he appeared inside the tomb, striking at the anvil. All of this returned to what it was like shortly after the tyrant stepped in. However, Klein in his pontiff attire had vanished. His two marionettes along with the remnant bubbles of the spirit world plunderer had vanished as well. The corresponding figure was unable to return as the rebooted scene shattered, turning back to the desolate state after the battle. Tail Devourer Ouroboros watched silently for a long while before making a move. The grayish-white swath that rose up from the depth of Calderon City slowly receded back down. Above the gray fog, Klein slumped in the high-back chair of the fool in exhaustion. He wasn't even able to get Enzo and Ludwell to massage him. He had already thrown the sea god scepter back to the junk pile. The tyrant card had left his soul body and was placed facing down beside the Black Emperor card. The spirit world plunderer's bubbles were floating ahead, with the Beyonder characteristic constantly seeping out before combining with the points of light. After resting for a while, Klein saw grayish-white powder fall onto the model table's surface. Following that was a transparent item that seemed weightless. The item was the size of a palm, formed by coiled maggots. It was almost shaped like a human, and its interior was filled with a colorless liquid. Bubbles often emerged, scattering black hints of light. Klein didn't dare to look at it carefully, as there was a more complicated structure in the weightless transparent object. They formed indescribable patterns and symbols that seemed to fuse knowledge, power, transformation, secrets, bizarreness, and madness within, making them no longer abstract. This made Klein feel very dizzy. His mind was even on the verge of breaking down, with his soul almost losing control. This is likely the true soul of the spirit world plunderer. I have the corresponding powder as well. There's about 70 grams, more than I needed. It's more than I expected. Klein nodded indiscernibly and stored the powder into a box. Together with the true soul body, he threw them on the junk pile and covered it with the gray fog. After completing this, he raised his hand to rub his temples and made a self-deprecating remark. If it wasn't for the sea god scepter, I probably would have had to leave Calderon City due to the assault of the spirit world plunderer. I would then wait until I had helpers and could make the most solid of hunting plans so as to control the stirrings of the area to not alarm the unknown entity at the core region. Sigh, I was rash the entire time. Although the outcome was fine, it really doesn't suit my character. It's also completely at odds with the seer pathways acting. In the future, I should try to avoid using the sea god scepter in the outside world. The spirit world plunderer has been successfully hunted. There's no need for me to get Miss Sharon's help. In a few days, I'll write to her so that she won't be thinking over this matter. However, I have a premonition that I'll still be heading to Calderon City in the future. When that happens, perhaps I might still need Miss Sharon's help. In addition, I have to seek out information on Bizarro Banes. I can't put all my hope on the City of Silver. Amidst his thoughts, Klein directly returned to his body, without bringing his marionettes. He ended the ritual and headed straight for bed, falling asleep the moment his head hit the pillow. Escaped? Soest looked at the man opposite him and asked Daily Simone, who was carrying out a spirit channeling. They had just finished their operation and had captured a few numinous episcopate members. However, the key personnel the intel pointed at, Hand of White Palenque to Siblius, wasn't at the secret gathering point. He was a Sequence 4 demigod, therefore, not only had the Red Gloves team used a Grade 1 sealed artifact, they had even requested Goddesses Ilya's help. However, it was all futile. Daily Simone nodded. Yes. She then looked at the captive, suddenly speaking with an ethereal voice. Where did Palenque to Siblius go? He said he was going to meet someone, the numinous episcopate member answered slowly. Who is that person? Daily Simone pressed. Leonard Mitchell and company also cast their gazes over. The man who was being spirit-channeled answered with an unperturbed voice, Inst Zangwil. Chapter 930 Former Organization, Inst Zangwil. Upon hearing the name, all the Red Gloves present fell silent. Not a single one spoke for a moment. Ever since this former bishop betrayed and fled the church of Evernight had never relaxed its pursuit of him. Archbishops and high-ranking deacons who took up high posts had taken turns being responsible for searching for him. They helped each other, often bringing the relevant sealed artifacts everywhere to search for clues about him. But ultimately, they were unable to lock onto Ince Zangwill. He slipped away as a result of all kinds of coincidences, his shadow wasn't even noticed. Furthermore, he had caused several major events that killed many Nighthawks. To the Church of Evernight, especially the Nighthawks, he was someone they hated that had also insulted them. Without realizing it, Leonard Mitchell had already clenched his hanging fists as his breathing grew deeper. He soon forced himself to extricate himself from the sudden emotions that emerged within him. He turned his attention to something else. It was no wonder Dwayne Dantes was able to meet Ince Zangwill on Waypoint Island in the Berserk Sea. It was because the latter's goal was also the southern continent, East Balam. Amidst everyone's silence, Daily Simone immediately used her spirit body to emit an ethereal voice without any obvious changes. With some coldness, she spoke at a quickened pace. "Where are they meeting?" The numinous episcopate member shook his head blankly. "I don't know." Daly raised a few more questions, but she didn't get an ideal reply. Finally, she took a step back and cast her eyes at the Red Gloves team captain, Soest. Soest sighed and deliberated over his words before saying, "First, we need to inform this piece of intel to Her Excellency, Goddess's Eye. We shall leave it to her to contact the Holy Cathedral. Ince, who has 0-08 with him, isn't someone a Red Gloves team can handle. Second, we should continue investigating and follow this clue pertaining to Palenque to Siblius. Let's hope that we can figure out Ince Zangwill's motives. With the situation of us not being able to track him or lock onto him, grasping his motives is more important than knowing where he is. Perhaps, it can help us set up a trap that he has no choice but to step into. Finally, from now on, everyone is to take note of any coincidences. Regardless of the reason, they are to be reported to me." "Yes, Captain," the Red Glove members replied in unison. Leonard maintained his silence as he turned his head to glance at Daily Simone. He found that this gatekeeper who addressed herself as a spirit medium was similarly silent. Her gaze was dark. At the same time, he heard Palaz Zorost's slightly aged voice resound in his mind, "Heh, from the looks of it, I'll be witnessing a play of running and pursuing. What does old man mean? Is he hinting at something? We just decided to start investigations on Ince Zangwill's motives, and it's already known by 0-08? Leonard looked away and suddenly had an idea. If a person who is already dead was to secretly do the relevant investigation, would he be able to avoid 0-08's notice? After 2 hours of sleep, Klein rubbed his still throbbing head and slowly got out of bed. Following that, he pulled the bell by the side of the door and waited for an attendant to arrive. Before long, a native deliberately dressed in lone attire, a white shirt and red vest knocked on the door. Klein twisted the handle and opened a tiny gap in the door. He instructed with a hoarse voice, "Send another lunch set to the room. I had my meal too early." At that instant, he already looked like the tanned Enzo. As a gentleman living in a luxurious room with 2 servants, it was impossible for him to personally instruct the attendant at the door. "Yes sir, a lunch set. Any special requests?" The native attendant took out some paper and a pen and began recording as he asked with a rather strange Loanese accent. Klein used an equally odd Loanese accent. "With braised meat as the main dish, match it with a cup of sparkling wine with ice and lemon." "Do I include 2 servant meals?" the native attendant asked, following the usual procedure. Klein was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "Yes." After ending the conversation, he closed the door and quickly set up a ritual, bringing back Enzo and Ludwell from above the grey fog to the real world. As for Creeping Hunger and Word of the Sea, he temporarily left them in the junk pile. One of them was starving, and the other could hardly resist the urge to sing. After Klein controlled the marionettes to clean up his room, a few attendants came to deliver lunch. Soon, the entire room was filled with the sounds of cutlery hitting the plate and a soft chewing sound. After some time, Klein put down his cutlery, picked up his napkin, and wiped his mouth. In satisfaction, he leaned backward and shook his head helplessly. If this continues, I'll really become fat. The two marionettes had already lost the ability to eat, but to conceal that fact, Klein had no choice but to add servant meals. With him unwilling to see food go to waste, he could only try to eat as much as he could. Thankfully I'm a faceless. Klein covered his mouth as he burped before drinking the last bit of sparkling wine. Only at this moment did he feel like he had recovered. He now had the energy to consider the various details of his trip to Calderon City. The Marauder pathway is truly terrifying. Just a charm created from a worm of time is able to achieve such incredulous effects. As a king of angels, it's obvious how terrifying Blasphemer Amon is. Even an avatar isn't easy to deal with. Thankfully, I didn't put on a brave front. I knew to mimic those with experience and directly fled to the southern continent. The true creator places a great importance on me. He directly got Tail Devourer Ouroboros to rush over. This does have a feeling of traveling across time. The angels on ancient murals are just walking out and standing before me. Thankfully, I was still able to directly end the summoning. Just as Klein thought of this, his expression sank as he discovered a serious problem. Ouroboros is a king of angels from the monster pathway. This also meant that he could directly see the uniqueness about him. He could see the grayish-white fog and see the illusory door formed of spherical lights and the transparent and translucent maggots that formed the spherical lights. What does this actually imply? The angel of fate who has survived since the second epoch should know something. And the true creator probably knows more. Could they be able to tell that I'm the master of the mysterious space above the gray fog? Regardless, the importance they place on me will rise. Klein clenched his right fist and put it to order or Rose Redemption might take. He felt lucky that, be it Rose Redemption or the Aurora Order, they had yet to lock onto any of the fool's believers. However, during the chaotic battle outside Byam, when he was still active as Gehrman Sparrow, he had thrown out the Tinder Glove, which had been corrupted by the true creator, to attempt to attract a saint from the Aurora Order. This might very well have led to the crazy adventurer to enter the suspect list. From the clues extending outward from Gehrman Sparrow, there's Admiral of Stars, Vice Admiral Iceberg, Danitz, and Anderson. All of them will be investigated by the Aurora Order. I have to warn them. Klein slowly exhaled and stood up, prepared to head above the gray fog. From his point of view, the pursuit of Gehrman Sparrow by the military, Church of Storms, Rose School of Thought, and Numinous Episcopate were all different. The true creator's believers were rather crazy and had a king of angels, a leader who was good at prying into the secrets of fate, active in the real world. This way, it didn't matter if Catlia and company were at sea, making it difficult to be locked on. There was still the risk of them being found. Among them, Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina and the Fog Sea's strongest hunter Anderson weren't people Klein was worried too much about. They knew little, nothing that pointed towards the core problem. Nothing much would happen aside from the need to consider whether the bunch of lunatics of the Aurora Order would employ extreme methods in the interrogation process. West Balam, Northern State. In the Kukua city ruled by May Sanchez. Danitz, who was chewing on roasted meat, paused suddenly. He heard Mr. Fool pass him the warning from Gehrman Sparrow. Be careful of the Numinous Episcopate. Be careful of the Aurora Order, especially the latter. Pay special attention. Also, warn Anderson Hood as well as Edwina Edwards. Be careful of the Numinous Episcopate. Be careful of the Aurora Order. How many has it been? The military, Church of Storms, Church of Evernight, Rose School of Thought. What did Gehrman Sparrow do? Why has he offended so many factions? Dogs hit. Danet's expression froze before grimacing. He had no idea that the strongest person of the 7 pirate admirals had changed. Opposite him, Anderson put down the knife he used to slice meat, pricked up his brows, and curiously asked, "Have you recalled something?" Danet secretly took a deep breath and asked after some deliberation, "Have you heard of the Aurora Order?" He wasn't sure if Anderson knew. After all, the Aurora Order was a rather secretive organization in the beginning. Its reputation was later built up in the Lone Kingdom. Anderson chuckled. "I'm actually more surprised that you know of them. Did your captain tell you?" Without waiting for Danetz to answer, he combed his short hair with his finger and continued, "They believe that the Creator is omnipresent. Everything has godhood. They believe that life is nothing but a spiritual journey. As long as one is willing to listen to their preachings, understand, discover, and gather the godhood, they will eventually become angels to transcend reality." Such an idea doesn't sound bad, but that's not the main point. The main point is that they believe in the true Creator. Upon hearing that, Danetz couldn't help but jeer, "You know quite a bit, just slightly less than I know." Anderson immediately curled the ends of his mouth and said with a beaming smile, "Of course. I once joined an organization in Intis. They hope to change society, the world, to make the supernatural no longer secret and to be out in the open for everyone to see, so as to become true rulers. They're called the Iron and Blood Cross Order, and they also believe in the true Creator." Danetz's expression froze as cold sweat oozed out of his forehead. Chapter 931 New Method to Acquiring Intel. Glancing at Danetz's expression, Anderson continued as though he didn't notice a thing. "However, their brains appear to have been eaten by zombies. They were fervent to the point of stupidity. They didn't adhere to my sense of aesthetics. So after cheating them of their things, I quit." Why's your face a little pale? You're even sweating. Did you get heatstroke? As a hunter, shouldn't adapting to the environment be an intrinsic ability? Danetz lifted his right hand and wiped his sweat. Cursing inwardly, he forced a smile and said, "I've heard that once someone believes in an evil god, it's almost impossible to escape the faith." As he spoke, he raised his chin slightly, wearing a look as though he was musing over the circumstances of his future death. It didn't cross his mind that Gehrman Sparrow had just offended the Aurora Order and was being targeted by the true Creator's believers. He also didn't make the connection that he was believing in a suspected evil god, the fool. "Well said," Anderson replied with a smile that didn't have the slightest hint of gloom. "It's not like I have any true faith. Back then, the incantations I said were lines I modified from the God of knowledge and wisdom. Since they don't really enjoy using their brains, no, they don't even have that. As long as you superficially appear devout, any random excuse can be used to fool them." Without waiting for Danetz to develop the discussion further, he asked, "Why are you suddenly asking about the Aurora Order?" Danetz bit down on his roasted meat and slowly chewed and swallowed. After a deliberate pause of 20 to 30 seconds, he said, "I just recalled something. For some reason, Gehrman Sparrow has been identified by the Aurora Order as a high-priority elimination target. Oh right, there's also the Numinous Episcopate. And both you and me are known to have relations with him. You want me to be careful against the Aurora Order and the Numinous Episcopate?" Anderson nodded in enlightenment as he chuckled. "You've recently mentioned something similar. Rose School of Thought, Church of Storms, Lone Military. Man, at times, I even feel that Gehrman Sparrow is more suited to being a hunter than me." Danetz could hardly retort as he nodded heavily in agreement. Anderson thought for a moment when he suddenly changed topics out of the blue. "What do you plan on doing here in West Balam? Helping Gehrman Sparrow with something?" Upon hearing this question, Danetz fell silent for a second. He put down the item in his hand and tidied his clothes in an unhurried manner. "Investigate the faith of the different classes of West Balam. This was determined after his discussion with Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina. In common parlance, it meant investigating the developments of the various secret organizations and factions in West Balam. Of course, this included some preliminary contact with the local ruling forces, and to figure out if they had any desire to purchase firearms. Investigate the faith of the different classes of West Balam. Anderson repeated Dannett's words as he reflectively raised his right hand to rub his temples as though he had a headache. After the end of the tarot gathering, and warning Admiral of Stars to take note of the Aurora Orders and Numinous Episcopate's investigations, with the best choice being seeking the Moses Ascetic Order's help, Klein busily finished the three-party transaction between the world, the moon, and the sun. He received £5,000 in return. After dinner, he bit on an unlit disguised smoke pipe as he read the papers. Then, he saw Miss Messenger walk out of the void to deliver him a letter. Leonard's. Klein reached out to receive it and noticed that Rionette Tynker didn't stay at all. She had rapidly returned to the spirit world. This also made him determine that Leonard Mitchell had already paid the mailing fee, hence, he took out his other hand and unfolded the letter. Ince Zangwill has appeared in East Balam. He's suspected to have met with Palenque Tesiblius from the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction, Ince Zangwill. Klein ruminated over the name as he slowly leaned back into his reclining chair. In the letter, Leonard wished that he could do some investigations in secret to figure out Ince Zangwill's motives. But the problem is that 0-08 has the characteristic of any mention of it will be known. Knowing of it also means being known by it. Besides, it's good at arranging coincidences, making people follow its directions without even realizing it. Under such circumstances, it's very difficult to avoid 0-08's notice while investigating Ince Zangwill. Not only is there no chance of success, it's also easy to expose myself. As Klein thought, he made Enzo walk behind him and begin massaging his shoulder. He read Leonard Mitchell's letter again, hoping to find more clues and incisive points for investigations from those few words. East Balam. Numinous Episcopate. Artificial death. Palenque Tesiblius. Why is Ince Zangwill looking for them for? Trying to find allies for the true mastermind behind the Great Smog of Backlund, that royal family's faction? Artificial death. Artificial death. As Klein thought, he suddenly recalled that there was a matter that no one knew other than himself and Mr. Azek. The Evernight goddess had preliminarily gained control of the death pathway's uniqueness, in other words, artificial death. Presently, she was usurping, digesting, and wielding the corresponding authority. In other words, the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction's target of belief was, in a way, the Evernight goddess. After the authority was fully transferred and seized, they were bound to suffer a purge before slowly merging with the Church of Evernight. Or they might continue their work, making contact with the other Numinous Episcopate factions and other secret factions while unnoticeably cooperating with the Nighthawks. To Klein, this wasn't anything of importance. What was important was, that in an ancient text he found before, it mentioned, to artificially create death, a number of Numinous Episcopate members had to pray to the uniqueness daily, as though it was a true deity. It was an attempt to slowly awaken its sentience and allow it to come to life. Of course, this was only one part of the overall plan which wasn't critical. Then, could it be possible that when Palenque Tesiblius prayed to artificial death, he had mentioned Ince Zangwill's motives and had sought blessings? But he will probably never imagine that artificial death has already been controlled by the Evernight goddess. Although it hasn't become part of her manifestation, it has already lost its freedom. From this angle, directly setting up a ritual to pray to the goddess might allow one to obtain Ince Zangwill's motives. That's quite possible. The more Klein thought about it, the more certain he was that his seemingly ridiculous plan would succeed. And as for the reason why this could become a reality, it was because the enemy's leader was their spy. After getting Enzo to stop massaging him, Klein slowly got up and paced about, considering if he should make the attempt, and if so, how. Ince Zangwill is a traitor of the church. He's an insult to all Nighthawks. If there's a chance to wipe him out, the goddess should be very willing to see it happen. She wouldn't mind providing some help. But the goddess is now in a critical stage of seizing the artificial death's authority. She will not be able to provide answers for a long period of time, and she can only provide feedback to normal ritualistic magic. Besides, I also lack the corresponding materials. Also, I've been constantly warning myself to be on guard. I must not fully trust and rely on the goddess. On second thoughts, directly praying to her to obtain a revelation might not be too good. I hope to maintain a safe distance. Amidst his thoughts, Klein felt a little hesitant. He began letting his thoughts wander in a bid to find a more acceptable plan. Suddenly, he had a more ridiculous idea. Directly pray to artificial death. This actually posed no danger. This was because artificial death wasn't able to respond to prayers and rituals. If there was any feedback, it meant that it was essentially controlled by the Evernight goddess. On the other hand, Klein had the feather produced and left behind from the artificial death project. He also had Azek's copper whistle. He didn't need to spend too much time to gather the ingredients needed to set up a ritual for a revelation. In addition, there's a layer in between us. I'm not directly contacting the goddess. Perhaps, this might even help her further seize artificial death's authority. Klein consoled himself as he began busying himself. He first used the sacrificial and bestowment ritual. He brought back the 2 remaining feathers and some full moon essence oil, night vanilla powder, and other items which he had not used in a while to the real world. Then, he modified the sacrificial altar and completed the first part of the preparations. After all, he was essentially praying to the Evernight goddess. He couldn't be bothered to head out to buy ritualistic materials of the death domain. This was essentially the same as other normal ritualistic magic. With great familiarity, Klein lit the candles, dripped some essential oils, and drew the symbols for human and concealment on an artificial goatskin. Then, in the thin fog that spread, he pressed Azek's copper whistle over it. Immediately after that, he placed the white feather stained with pale yellow oil stains inside the silver bowl that had burning herbal powder. He then watched it curl without any signs of it turning black. After exhaling silently, Klein took a step back and chanted in Hermes, "You are the essence of death, you are the Lord of the dead, you are the final home to all living beings. I pray for your help, I pray for you to tell me the motives for Ince Zangwill's contact with the numinous episcopate." Just as he said those words, the 3 candlelight burgeoned as though they brightened significantly but were tainted with a dark green. The surroundings turned cold and creepy. Klein closed his eyes and entered cogitation for 30 seconds, feeling uneasy. He walked in front of the altar, picked up the full moon essence oil and dripped 1 drop onto each of the 3 candles. After doing this, he took away Azek's copper whistle, grabbed the artificial goatskin, and moved it close to the candlelight representing himself. When it ignited, he threw it into the silver bowl. With a whoosh, the white feather which didn't show any signs of damage soared with pale white flames, covering the entire silver bowl and obstructing Klein's vision. About 3 seconds later, the fire subsided, leaving a mound of powder in the silver bowl. The powder moved without the help of any wind, forming one word after another, possessed by an evil spirit. Requires exorcism. Chapter 932 Thin-skinned. The goddess really replied. Upon seeing the words formed by the powder, Klein's first reaction had nothing to do with the content. Instead, he was shocked that this seemingly ridiculous thing had happened. Although he was already mentally prepared and had believed that the chance of success was rather high, he still felt conflicting emotions. It took him almost a minute to accept it. After a while, Klein exhaled slowly, raised his right hand, and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise manner. "Praise the Lady. He then ended the ritual, forcing himself to focus his attention on the revelation itself. Possessed by an evil spirit. Requires exorcism? Ins Zangwill actually got possessed by an evil spirit? He had gone from sequence 9 to sequence 5 of the death pathway. The godhood he obtained at the critical stage is also sequence 4 Nightwatcher of the Evernight pathway, one that is good at dealing with spirit body type creatures. Evil spirits and wraiths should be afraid of him, so why would he end up being possessed? That's unless the evil spirit's level is extremely high or, at its core, is very special. Unfortunately, I've only met one evil spirit in the truest sense of the word. It's that ancient evil spirit sealed in the underground ruins of Alista Tudor. I know little about such monsters, so it's difficult for me to grasp the details. I can write to ask Miss Sharon. I can also get little son to find out more. That shepherd elder Lovia had grazed an evil spirit. It's no wonder Ins Zangwill is trying to meet a demigod of the numinous episcopate. When it comes to exorcising evil spirits, aside from the Church of Evernight and Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun, the best would probably be the numinous episcopate. There's probably the Church of the God of Combat as well. Neighboring pathways often have similar traits. There's also one point that can be gleaned from this. Ins Zangwill doesn't wish for his possessed state to be known by the royal family faction and the Demonist sect who are in cahoots with him. Otherwise, there's no need for him to come all the way to the southern continent. The two factions existed before the Fifth Epoch, and they have a long legacy. It's quite unlikely that they don't have a sealed artifact that can remove or exorcise evil spirits. Even if they can't find one, getting the Demonist sect to contact the numinous episcopate is definitely safer and more covert than getting Ins Zangwill to make the trip himself. As his thoughts raced, Klein unfolded a piece of paper and wrote, "The intel you have provided me made me connect certain clues from what I've previously gathered. And due to a particular great existence's help, this points to a clear conclusion: Ins Zangwill is possessed by an evil spirit, and he's seeking the numinous episcopate's help. Just based on this fact alone, we can make several useful judgments. Ins Zangwill will often manifest inconsistency in his words and actions. He will often deviate from his normal path, doing something we feel that is absolutely impossible for him to do, and to make mistakes we find incomprehensible. Before this problem is resolved, he will not stop having contact with the numinous episcopate. It might even become more frequent. Making investigations based on this might allow us to catch Ins Zangwill by the tail. However, I believe we still wouldn't be able to lock onto him. The creation of coincidences from that great oak sealed artifact is insurmountable." Upon writing this, Klein couldn't help but recall his direct encounter with Ins Zangwill. His own investigations didn't directly point to him, but it caused their ploy to nearly fail. Hence, Ins Zangwill personally took action, sending a meteor falling from the sky in an attempt to kill Sherlock Moriarty so as to obliterate any clues. And he ultimately received Mr. Azek's help and escaped the dire situation, forcing Ins Zangwill to step into the limelight and expose himself. Back then, if Mr. Azek had recovered to his former strength, Ins Zangwill might already be dead. But to replicate such a situation and force him to appear before me is still extremely difficult. After all, back then, not only was there Mr. Azek, a death consul, and my use of the grey fog to foil the coincidences, there was also Trissy Cheek and the ring, which was suspected to be a Grade O sealed artifact. Without her suddenly escaping, Ins Zangwill wouldn't have been forced to personally take action. Klein deliberated as he wrote, "If we can figure out the origins and primary goals of the evil spirit, there might be a chance of the situation having a favorable change." After writing the matters regarding Ins Zangwill, Klein's heart stirred. Just as he was about to mention something else, he stopped his pen after writing the first few letters. He raised his left hand and pinched his cheeks. He appeared to be in a serious dilemma and seemed a little embarrassed. After muttering silently a few times, Klein finally smoothly wrote the rest. "Even without that Grade O sealed artifact's help, Ins Zangwill is an enemy you and I are unable to face head-on. We need to make plenty of preparations. If you can provide me with some worms of time, I can use them to create high-level charms that can deal with demigods. It's called a fate siphon charm. It can swap the fates of yourself and the target for a short period of time. Putting down his fountain pen, Klein didn't take a second look as he quickly folded the letter and seriously sealed it in an envelope. He then took out the adventurer's harmonica and a gold coin before summoning Miss Messenger. He got her to take away the reply letter to Leonard Mitchell, but this time, it wasn't addressed to 7 Pinster Street. Instead, it was directly sent to Leonard's present address. With Leonard having just written the letter, Klein didn't believe that he had moved out of Rionette Tinker's detection range. After doing all of this, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he shook his head slightly. Requesting the help of others is really a difficult task. It's even more so for someone as thin-skinned as me. He quickly retracted his attention and once again modified Enzo's and Ludwell's appearances. After all, they had been seen by Angel of Fate Ouroboros during their exploration of Calderon City. During this process, Klein suddenly had an idea. He planned on sending them above the gray fog and using the Spirit World Plunderer's true soul body for a disguise. The Spirit World Plunderer could make its soul avatars take the form of its true soul body, and it could also get them to disguise themselves as other Spirit World creatures. The Beyonder ingredient it left behind must have had such abilities. However, it would be difficult to use it with the poor effects and the huge negative side effects. However, this wasn't a problem for Klein, who possessed the mysterious space above the gray fog. After all, he didn't plan on using the Beyonder ingredient for actual combat. Doing some changes to his marionette didn't require too many smooth operations and great effects. Furthermore, this could be slowly adjusted. As for the negative effects that came from the godhood, it wasn't something to consider. Who wasn't obedient when left in the junk pile? After a series of tasks, Klein sat at the high-back chair of the Fool. In his hand was the palm-sized Spirit World Plunderer's true soul body. Without looking down to look at it in detail, he extended his spirituality bit by bit into it. There wasn't much changes to the scene before him. It was still the illusory and dense black spirit body threads. However, when he tried controlling them, he discovered that not only could he control the marionette spirit body threads, but he could also let his spirit body threads extend out and penetrate into their bodies. When both sides established such a two-way connection, Klein suddenly felt that he and his marionette was one. All his Beyonder powers could be enacted on the other party through the spirit body threads, including his trick for changing his appearance and body. Amidst a slow and difficult process, Klein felt rather groggy as he felt his emotions turned into a mess. He began showing signs of losing control. This was an inevitable outcome from having his spirituality make direct contact with godhood. He hurriedly diverted some attention to stir some of the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog, and he restored his condition back to its normal state. After enduring the torment, Klein finished his attempt. Enzo had transformed into a southern continent native that looked like he came from a plantation. Ludwell had a mixed blood feel to him. His ghastly face was no longer more bone than flesh. Instead, there was a plumpness to it. As for the silver mask that had the effect of placating the soul, there was no way of removing it for the time being. All Klein could do was let it stick to Ludwell's chest. This still had a certain level of effect, but it was inferior to wearing it on his face. It could barely maintain the status quo. Unfortunately, there's no way to change this mask into other types of accessories. Otherwise, it would save me quite a bit of trouble. As Klein rushed to throw the Spirit World Plunderer's true soul body back onto the junk pile, he rubbed his temples and allowed his thoughts to wander. Right, I still have a Soul Assurer Beyonder characteristic here that can be made into a mystical item to replace that mask. No, I've always planned on returning it to the church. I'll mail it to him when Leonard replies. After the discomfort slowly subsided, Klein took out his golden pocket watch and opened it to check the time. Following that, he summoned a paper figurine and stirred some of the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog. He then threw both into a specially labeled point of light. It was the point of light representing the fool's only believer at present, Danitz. From Klein's point of view, Admiral of Stars Katlia had the Moses ascetic order backing her. Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina was from the Church of Knowledge and Wisdom. Anderson Hood didn't know much about Gehrman Sparrow, and being good at identifying the situation he was in, he wasn't one to put on a brave front. Therefore, when the Aurora Order did an investigation, it was unlikely that they would be in grave danger. Danitz was the only exception. With him in West Balam and not able to return to the Golden Dream anytime soon, his lacking strength, and him often wearing the boxing glove that made him act rashly, it was truly worrisome. Due to this fact, Mr. Fool had to work a little harder. He gave Danitz a paper angel's embrace every day at a fixed time, so as to disrupt any divination or prophecies about him. Leonard never expected Klein Moretti to reply that quickly. With some level of incredulity, he opened the envelope and read the corresponding content. Due to a particular great existence's help. Is he referring to the Fool? Indeed, Klein's investigations into Zangwil has already reached a significant depth. He has already figured out the truth the moment I mentioned the numinous episcopate. Possessed by an evil spirit? How did he end up being possessed by an evil spirit? How do we make use of it? Worms of time. This, Leonard quickly scanned through the last part of the letter as his expression suddenly became complicated. In his mind, Palaz Zoroast maintained his silence without saying a word. Chapter 933 Evil Spirits Common Trait. After a while, Leonard cleared his throat and wore a smile without realizing it. He said with a suppressed voice, "Old man, Klein's. This suggestion seems pretty good. It's very, very viable. The effects should be quite substantial. Why don't you consider it? Didn't you mention that you would do your best to help me exact revenge? I thought Worms of Time could only be used for avatars and act as support," he subconsciously droned on while Palaz Zoroast remained silent the entire time. Only after a while did he sigh lightly and say, "I can only give you a maximum of 2 Worms of Time." Without waiting for Leonard to say a word, he added, "To exact revenge on a demigod who wields a Grade O sealed artifact, the most important thing is still your own level and strength. Otherwise, you won't have a chance of using it even if you have a high-level charm." Leonard wiped away his smile and nodded seriously. "I'll do my best digesting my potion. If you finish digesting it and fail to accumulate enough contribution points, I'll help you seek out the Beyonder ingredients needed for Spirit Warlock." As for only having 2 Worms of Time, he wasn't disappointed at all. It was already a bonus. Just getting 1 was a great boon. Having 2 meant that he and Klein could split it, each of them having 1 Fate Siphon charm. After expressing his attitude, he asked in puzzlement, "Old man, do you think Klein has already used the previous Worm of Time as a charm?" He remembered very clearly that, back when they were figuring out who Emlyn White was supporting, Old Man had parasitized Tinder with a Worm of Time. Later, it lost contact and failed to be of any use. Now, on retrospection, just Emlyn White's and Sherlock Moriarty's close relationship made it easy for him to figure out the truth. The Worm of Time had been eliminated by the upper echelons of the secret organization or even the Fool himself. Furthermore, there was a high chance that it had been bestowed to Klein. Otherwise, his former colleague wouldn't have known of the existence of the Worm of Time. Palaz Zoroast immediately scoffed. If he hasn't already used it and seen its effects, why would he raise the issue and ask for more? All right. I need to separate the Worms of Time. This will make me fall asleep for at least 2 weeks. If you have any questions, find someone to answer them by yourself. With that said, not giving Leonard a chance to raise further questions, heat scattered his spirituality and created a blob of light that hung high inside Leonard's mind as though he didn't wish to speak. Leonard's instinctive response was to chuckle dryly. He focused his attention back onto the letter from Klein Moretti as he carefully read it again. Possessed by an evil spirit. The origins and primary goals of the evil spirit. I don't know much about evil spirits. Nothing comes to mind. After a few minutes of thought, Leonard took out a matchbox and burned the letter. Then, he left the room which the local Nighthawks had assigned him at the last minute. He came to a room diagonally opposite his and knocked on the door. Before long, Daly, who hadn't removed her blue eyeshadow and blush, opened the door and pricked up her eyebrows. When did a sleepless have the courage to knock on a lady's door at a time highly associated with a bed? Ahem. I have some questions I'd like to consult you about. Leonard obviously didn't dare respond to Daly's comment as he immediately expressed the reason why he was here. Daly sized him up and chuckled. I'm not responsible for counseling minors. As she spoke, she made way and allowed Leonard to enter her room. Without daring to let his eyes wander, he casually pulled a round stool to sit on. He then went straight to the point. Ma'am, I'd like to know more about evil spirits. You're a sequence 5 of the death pathway. You have higher clearance than me. You should know quite a lot. Why are you asking me this? Daly propped herself with her hands on the edge of the table behind her. Without waiting for him to reply, she continued, most evil spirits are the result of dead high-sequence beyonders. A small number of them are wraiths who break through various restrictions by using various opportunities. The first situation is more common. After high-sequence beyonders consume a potion to obtain godhood, their soul body would have experienced a mutation. It would be a mutation at their core. This allows their soul body to remain even in death or when their powers are dispersed. There will be a certain level of divinity to it, making them rather terrifying. The second situation isn't different on a fundamental level. Normally speaking, evil spirits will weaken with the passage of time until they completely dissipate. However, they can also assimilate into the region where they were born, making the spirit world and even the underworld fuse with it. They then extract power from this to maintain their existence. Therefore, many evil spirits have their own territory in active range. It's not that they do not wish to leave, but they can't. The only exception is when they accumulate sufficient power, allowing their existence to experience a fundamental change. Leonard habitually crossed his right leg over his left and pressed in thought, can evil spirits leave their territory by possessing a person? Yes, but ordinary humans and most beyonders are unable to withstand the extraction effect the evil spirits have on their bodies. They will quickly lose their spirituality and body temperature and be unable to last long. As Daly spoke, she raised her hand to point at herself. The best method is to rely on beyonders of the death pathway. Of course, it has to be at least a sequence 5, because from Gatekeeper, we will have our own dead spirit prison in our bodies. It can be called a miniature underworld. It can provide an evil spirit with an adequate environment for their existence. Once you become a spirit warlock, you will also have similar powers. However, it will be more about sealing and sleeping than an internal underworld. Heh, those natural spirits and wraiths are truly troublesome when they come in and out. Zangwill's sequence 5 is Gatekeeper. It's no wonder that the evil spirit can possess him for long periods of time. Or could it be that he failed at an attempt to enslave an evil spirit? Leonard's thoughts opened up as he immediately made connections. He deliberated for a few seconds before asking, what sort of needs does an evil spirit have? Needs? Singing? Dancing? Poetry? Men? Women? The sea of stars? Daly returned with a question, amused. Leonard realized that his usage of words was problematic as he awkwardly ruffled his hair. I mean, what desires will an evil spirit have? That depends on what it desired while it was alive. Typically speaking, the remnant spirit will inherit the original obsessions, without being able to balance it rationally. If it were you, that evil spirit might attempt to write poems, imprison a group of spectators, and seek acknowledgement. Or it will do things in an ostentatious manner like the protagonist of a play, Daly joked. However, regardless of what it was while it was alive, as long as one becomes an evil spirit, they commonly desire two things. What are they? Leonard turned attentive. Daly shot a glance at him and said, "First, it's to feed on the souls of living creatures. This can pleasure them, an innate pleasure that stems from the need to maintain their existence. In addition, a large number of souls will allow them to escape the restrictions of their territory and active range. It will replace the power provided by the spirit world and underworld. Second, it's to seek out beyonder ingredients from their pathway while they were alive. Through this, they could create another foundation. At a certain stage, the evil spirit would no longer need to draw on the powers of the spirit world and underworld. They would no longer be restricted by their territories or active range. In a sense, they would have transformed into a special spirit world creature." Leonard seemed to realize something as he thought. This also means that evil spirits can consume sequence potions? No, sequence potions are created for human consumption. They reduce the risk of losing control. To many supernatural creatures, there's no need to do so. They can directly consume the ingredient raw. It's especially so for evil spirits. Their obsession, cruelty, ferociousness, and penchant for souls make them half crazy to begin with. There's no need to regulate it from other sources. Furthermore, they are spirit bodies, so the method of consumption is direct accommodation and slow digestion. Daly corrected Leonard's point. This. To the evil spirit that possesses its Zangwill, whenever it has the upper hand, it will control the body to seek out beyonder ingredients of its pathway while it was alive. Leonard was first surprised before he had an idea. He said in a pleasant surprise, "I understand. Thank you for answering my questions." With that said, he hesitated for a few seconds and asked after some deliberation, "Ma'am, I believe we shouldn't just figure out the motives behind Ince Zangwill's meeting with the numinous episcopate demigod, but we also need to track his trajectory since Backlund to East Balam. We need to know what he did midway, what items he found. This might lead us to effective clues." Daly suddenly fell silent before she pricked up her brows and said, "Well said. But what does this have to do with evil spirits?" "Nothing. I raised the question so as to make preparations because I believe that since we are investigating the numinous episcopate, we might encounter evil spirits. The latter half was a suggestion I wished to make after the break. I just wished to talk to you about it beforehand." Leonard's mind raced as he slowed down his speech and fabricated an excuse on the spot. Daly listened in silence and chuckled. "If you actually work so hard to fabricate stories in front of other girls, you'll no longer be single with those looks of yours. Unfortunately, I'm not a clueless girl. Alright, there's no need to explain further. Leave." Leonard stood up lamely without trying to emphasize his point. He then walked towards the door. Just as he gripped the handle, Daly's slightly ethereal voice sounded behind him, "I don't know what secret you're hiding, nor do I know what you know. None of that matters. But when it comes to Ince Zangwill, if you need any help or aid, you can find me." Leonard paused for 2 seconds as his mouth quivered. He then pulled open the door and walked out. City of Silver. Derek Berg had received the order to join an expedition team. Leading it was Chief Colin Iliad. Their target was Noise City. It was in a northern city's ruins where the shapeshifter and other terrifying creatures lived. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.